Thinking completed, history does not always reach its final page. Sometimes it simply stops, mid-sentence, mid-trial, mid-accusation, leaving behind documents that trail off into silence. The Vatican Apostolic Archives contain over 85 linear kilometers of such fragments. Parchment scrolls ending abruptly, trial transcripts with missing final pages, diplomatic cables marked suspended indefinitely, investigations closed without verdict. These are not conspiracies buried by shadowy forces. They are bureaucratic realities, cases abandoned when popes died, witnesses vanished, political winds shifted, or uncomfortable truths demanded quiet burial. What follows is not a catalog of lies, but a chronicle of absences. 100 stories that began with ink and parchment, yet never received the closure history promises. Each represents a fracture in the historical record. Not because someone erased the ending, but because endings themselves are fragile human constructs. Institutions endure, individual cases do not. Memory persists, documentation fails. This is the quiet truth of archives. For every story neatly concluded, dozens simply stop. And in those stops, we find something more haunting than conspiracy. The raw texture of time itself, indifferent to our need for resolution. In 1587, the Roman Inquisition opened proceedings against Florentine merchant Lorenzo di Giovanni for possessing forbidden books. Trial transcripts record 3 interrogations, witness depositions naming 6 associates, and a formal accusation of heresy drafted by the tribunal secretary. The file includes a handwritten note, case to be reviewed by Cardinal Protector upon return from Avignon. But the cardinal never returned. He died of fever en route. The file bears no verdict, no sentence, no notation of dismissal. Lorenzo's name vanishes from Florentine tax records after 1589. Did he flee? Was he imprisoned without trial? Did the case quietly dissolve when the cardinal's successor showed no interest? The archive holds the beginning of his story with surgical precision. The ending exists only as negative space, a silence where a verdict should be. Thousands of such files crowd Inquisition registers. Accusations meticulously documented, evidence gathered, then nothing. Not suppression, not conspiracy, administrative entropy. A system designed for judgment, yet vulnerable to the mundane disruptions of mortality, distraction, and shifting priorities. These are not secrets the Vatican buried. They are stories the Vatican began and forgot to finish. October 16, 1943. Nazi SS officers rounded up 1,023 Jews in Rome's ghetto. Vatican intelligence networks tracked deportations in real time. Internal memoranda from Pius XII Secretariat document frantic efforts. Lists of hidden refugees compiled by parish priests, diplomatic cables to neutral embassies, discreet payments to Italian families sheltering escapees. One file, marked urgent, via Tasso prison, records the names of 17 Jewish men arrested during the roundup. Handwritten annotations track 3 who escaped through Vatican-assisted tunnels. 5 were confirmed deported to Auschwitz on October 18th, but 9 names remain unresolved. A marginal note dated November 2nd states, status unknown, investigation ongoing. The file closes there. No further entries, no death certificates, no survivor testimonies added post-war. These 9 men exist in history only as question marks, documented at the moment of capture, then erased from the record not by malice but by chaos. The Vatican knew their names, knew their addresses, knew they were in peril, but the machinery of rescue, stretched thin across a city under occupation, could not track every thread to its end. Their stories began with ink on papal stationery. They ended with a period that never arrived. This is not cover-up. It is the brutal arithmetic of crisis. Institutions can document suffering faster than they can resolve it. The archive preserves the beginning of compassion. It cannot always preserve the ending. In 1978, Banco Ambrosiano chairman Roberto Calvi met with Vatican Bank President Archbishop Paul Marcinkus in a Zurich hotel room. Witnesses confirmed the meeting. Bank records show $27 million transferred from Iwar accounts to Ambrosiano subsidiaries days later. When Ambrosiano collapsed in 1982, Europe's largest post-war bank failure, Italian magistrates demanded Vatican cooperation. Pope John Paul II authorized limited document release. Trial transcripts reveal Calvi received coded warnings before his death. A note slipped under his door reading, "They know about the London accounts." On June 18, 1982, Calvi was found hanging beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London, pockets stuffed with stones. British police initially ruled suicide. Italian investigators cried murder. Vatican files contain the Zurich meeting minutes, the transfer records, even a draft letter from Marcinkus warning Calvi to cease irregular operations. But the final page of the internal investigation file, dated July 1982, bears only 3 words: case suspended pending. No explanation, no resumption. The file was sealed. Calvi's death remains officially unsolved. Not because evidence was destroyed, though some documents vanished, but because the investigation halted at the threshold of uncomfortable truths about church finances. The story began with signatures on banking ledgers. It ended with a procedural pause that became permanent. History did not erase the ending. It simply stopped writing. Sister Maria Caterina della Croce entered the Carmelite convent of Santa Maria in Trastevere in 1921. By 1934, she reported mystical visions of the Virgin Mary requesting construction of a shrine on Vatican land near Castel Gandolfo. She documented 47 apparitions in a leather-bound diary submitted to the Holy Office. Local bishops investigated. Medical exams confirmed no psychosis. 2 cardinals recommended approval for a small chapel. Then silence. The file, preserved in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith archives, contains the diary, medical reports, episcopal endorsements. The final document is a memo dated March 12, 1937, Pope Pius XI to review personally. Pius XI died on February 10, 1939. The file bears no subsequent action, no rejection, no approval, no notation that the case lapsed with the Pope's death. Sister Maria died in 1968, still waiting for an answer. Her shrine was never built. Her visions were never condemned nor endorsed. The Church began her story with bureaucratic seriousness, collecting evidence, consulting experts, elevating it to papal attention. Then history intervened. A pope died. War came. New crises demanded attention. Her case did not vanish into conspiracy. It dissolved into the quiet gravity of institutional priorities. The archive holds her beginning with reverence. Her ending exists only as an administrative ellipsis. In 1956, Father Janusz Kowalski, a Polish priest serving in Chicago, was accused by 3 parishioners of inappropriate conduct with altar boys. Diocesan records show Archbishop Albert Meyer opened a canonical investigation. Father Kowalski was temporarily removed from ministry. 2 witnesses provided sworn statements. The accused priest submitted a written defense denying allegations. Then nothing. The file contains no verdict, no restoration to ministry, no laicization, no police report. In 1958, Father Kowalski appears on parish assignment lists in Milwaukee. By 1962, he is listed in Detroit. By 1970, his name disappears from all U.S. Catholic directories. Did the investigation conclude he was innocent? Were charges dropped for lack of evidence? Was he quietly transferred to avoid scandal? The archive holds the accusation with clinical detail. It holds a defense. It does not hold the resolution. This pattern repeats across thousands of mid-20th century files. Allegations documented, investigations launched, then suspended without conclusion. Not always malice, sometimes incompetence, sometimes the sheer volume of cases overwhelming limited diocesan resources. Sometimes bishops hoping time would heal what procedure could not resolve. These stories began with ink on canonical forms. They ended with administrative fatigue, a system designed for justice, strained beyond capacity. The silence is not always sinister. Sometimes it is simply exhaustion. Archaeologists excavating beneath St. Peter's Basilica in 1941 uncovered a 1st century Roman necropolis. Among 120 tombs, Tomb 74 contained fragments of red plaster bearing Greek graffiti. Petros Eni, Peter is within. Bone fragments recovered from a niche behind the tomb wall were analyzed by anthropologist Margherita Garducci in 1953. Her report, preserved in Vatican archives, concluded the remains belonged to a robust man aged 60 to 70, consistent with Peter's age at martyrdom. Pope Paul VI announced the discovery to the world in 1968. Yet Garducci's full analysis contains a troubling anomaly. The bones showed no evidence of crucifixion trauma. Early Christian tradition holds Peter was crucified upside down. Yet these remains, potentially the apostles, bear skeletal markers of natural death. Garducci's private notes, declassified in 2009, acknowledge this discrepancy. Either tradition errs on manner of death, or bones are not Peter's. Further testing impossible without disturbing venerated site. The investigation stopped there. No carbon dating goes. No comparative analysis with other apostolic-era remains. The Church had enough evidence for devotional certainty, but not enough for historical closure. The story began with shovels in sacred earth. It ended with a scientific question too delicate to answer. Not suppressed, simply set aside. History does not always demand resolution. Sometimes it accepts ambiguity as its final chapter. In 1983, Jesuit priest Father Pierre Benoit led a Vatican-sponsored excavation at Dominus Flevit Church on Jerusalem's Mount of Olives. Workers uncovered a 1st century ossuary inscribed with the name Yeshua bar Yehoseph, Jesus son of Joseph. Carbon dating placed it circa 30 to 70 CE. Benoit's field notes, preserved in the Pontifical Biblical Institute archives, describe profound theological implications requiring careful study. The ossuary was photographed, measured, sketched, then silence. No scholarly publication followed. No Vatican statement. No further analysis. The ossuary itself vanished from archaeological records after 1985. Benoit's final entry, dated November 12, 1984, recommendation, refer to Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith before publication. The file contains no response from the congregation. No reaction, no approval, no trace of the ossuary's current location. Was it deemed too theologically disruptive? Was it lost in bureaucratic limbo? Did officials quietly decide some questions lack answers the faithful are ready to hear? The story began with brushes against ancient limestone. It ended with a recommendation that triggered no action, a procedural dead end where archaeology met theology. The Vatican did not bury this discovery. It simply let it rest in the quiet space between evidence and interpretation. Cardinal Secretary of State Luigi Maglione maintained a private diary throughout World War II. Pages from 1940 to 1944 survived his 1944 death and entered Vatican archives. They contain raw, unvarnished accounts. Pius XII weeping after learning of Warsaw ghetto deportations. Tense meetings with German Ambassador Ernst von Weizsäcker. Lists of Jews hidden in Vatican properties. But the diary ends abruptly on August 3, 1944. The final entry reads, "Met with Pope Re, Allied advance on Rome. Matters of grave consequence discussed. Details to be recorded tomorrow." Maglione died of a heart attack that night. The details were never recorded. Historians have spent decades reconstructing that meeting from peripheral documents, diplomatic cables, 8 memoirs, Allied intelligence reports. But the Cardinal's first-hand account exists only as a promise of tomorrow that never came. The Vatican possesses the beginning of that critical conversation with surgical precision. The ending was stolen not by censorship, but by mortality. This is history's cruelest editing, not the erasure of truth, but its interruption by time itself. The archive holds what was written. It cannot hold what was meant to be written. In 1998, Pope John Paul II opened Inquisition archives to scholars. Among millions of pages, researcher and Jacobson Schutte discovered the case of Fra Dalsino, a 14th century Franciscan mystic accused of heresy in 1304. Trial records document his teachings on apostolic poverty, witness testimonies from followers, even transcripts of his interrogations. The file includes a draft verdict dated June 12, 1304, to be handed over to secular authorities for punishment. But no execution record exists, no confirmation of death, no vedia notation. Dalsino's name appears in a 1307 papal bull as recently deceased, yet no document confirms when or how he died. Did he escape custody? Die in prison before sentencing? Was his execution deliberately unrecorded to avoid martyrdom? The archive holds the accusation, the trial, the intended verdict. It does not hold the final act. Not because it was destroyed, though some medieval records were lost to fire, but because medieval bureaucracy, for all its meticulousness, had gaps. Messengers failed to deliver orders. Scribes neglected final entries. Wars disrupted record-keeping. Dalsino's story began with ink on vellum. It ended with the mundane fragility of human systems. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier, stories that simply stop. On December 2nd, 1925, Pope Pius XI received a sealed envelope from an anonymous sender. Vatican logbooks record its receipt, but not its contents. Standard procedure for unsolicited correspondence. The envelope was routed to the Secretariat of State. A notation dated December 5th states, "Contents reviewed by Monsignor Rapasardi. Matter requires papal attention." Pius XI personal secretary logged an appointment for December 8th, 10:30 a.m. Review, Rapasardi file. The Pope's diary confirms the meeting occurred, but no subsequent document references the envelope's contents. No action taken, no investigation launched, no notation that the matter was dismissed. The envelope itself, still preserved in acid-free storage, remains unopened to this day. Vatican protocol forbids opening correspondence addressed to deceased popes without extraordinary authorization. 3 subsequent pontiffs declined to break the seal. The story began with wax and parchment delivered to St. Peter's Square. It continues today as an unbroken seal in a climate-controlled vault. A story not ended, but suspended in perpetual anticipation. Not hidden, not buried, simply waiting for an ending that may never come. This is the archive's deepest truth. Some stories resist completion not by conspiracy, but by design. They exist in the space between question and answer, a silence that is itself a form of historical evidence. The Western Schism of 1378 fractured Christendom for 39 years. 3 rival popes claimed legitimacy simultaneously. Council of Constance, 1414 to 1418, resolved the crisis by deposing 2 claimants and accepting the third's resignation. Official histories declare unity restored in 1417 with Martin V's election. But Vatican archives preserve a haunting fragment. A petition dated 1421 from Sister Benedetta of Siena, a nun who had taken vows under Pope Gregory XII, the deposed Roman claimant. Her plea, having vowed obedience to a pope the Church now calls antipope, am I still bound by my vows? Or am I free to leave the convent? The petition was forwarded to the Rota Romana, the Church's highest tribunal. Case logs confirm receipt on March 17, 1421. No verdict exists, no precedent established, no notation that the case was dismissed as moot. Sister Benedetta's spiritual crisis, rooted in a geopolitical rupture the Church itself created, received no resolution. Did she remain in the convent, her vows hanging in theological limbo? Did she leave, carrying the stigma of broken promises? The archive holds her question with heartbreaking clarity. It does not hold the answer, not because officials refuse to answer, but because some wounds of history heal without closure, leaving individuals to navigate ambiguity long after institutions declare crises resolved. Her story began with a vow spoken in good faith. It ended with institutional silence, a gap between dogma and human need that no council could bridge. In 1965, Vatican II Schema 13 on religious freedom sparked fierce debate. Bishops from mission territories warned that affirming non-Christian religions might undermine evangelization. European prelates argued religious coercion violated human dignity. Drafts circulated for months. Compromise language emerged. The Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in other religions. But one critical question remained unresolved. Did this affirmation extend to Islam? Draft footnotes referenced Quranic passages on monotheism. Conservative cardinals demanded removal. Progressives insisted inclusion was essential for post-colonial dialogue. The final document, Nostra Aetate, mentions Islam positively but avoids theological equivalence. Yet Vatican archives contain a sealed appendix, a 3-page analysis by theologian Father George Anawati comparing Catholic and Islamic concepts of divine mercy. Dated October 28, 1965, the day the declaration was promulgated, the analysis bears a handwritten note for inclusion pending final review. It was never included, never rejected, never referenced again. The analysis remains in limbo, a theological bridge built but never crossed. Not suppressed, not forgotten, simply left waiting for a moment of courage that never arrived. The Council resolved the political question of religious freedom. It left the theological question hanging. A story begun with intellectual ambition, ended with prudent silence. History does not always provide answers. Sometimes it provides better questions and leaves them open. Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla launched Mexico's independence movement in 1810 with the Grito de Dolores, a cry for freedom echoing Catholic social teaching. He carried an image of Our Lady of Guadalupe as his banner. Captured in 1811, he was defrocked by church authorities and executed by royalists. Vatican archives contain his final letter to Pope Pius VII, smuggled out of prison. "I die for justice, not rebellion. Will the Church remember me as traitor or prophet?" The letter reached Rome in 1812. Logbooks confirm Pius VII read it personally. No reply was sent. No internal memorandum weighs Hidalgo's legacy. No notation whether the Pope wept or frowned. Hidalgo was excommunicated posthumously by Mexican bishops loyal to Spain. Yet in 1960, Pope John XCI quietly lifted the excommunication without public announcement. No document explains why. No ceremony marked the rehabilitation. Hidalgo's story began with a priest's cry for freedom. It ended with bureaucratic silence. A man caught between empire and revolution, remembered by historians but unresolved by the institution he served. The Vatican possesses his final question. It never recorded its answer, not out of malice, but because history moves faster than institutions can process moral complexity. Some figures remain suspended between condemnation and sainthood, not by conspiracy, but by time's refusal to simplify messy lives into neat categories. In 1939, archaeologists excavating beneath St. Peter's discovered a graffiti wall covered in 1st century Christian inscriptions. Among them, Petrosiana, Peter is here. But one graffito puzzled scholars. A crudely drawn ship with Greek letters, ICHDHYS, forming its hull. The early Christian symbol for Jesus. Beneath it, a single word, Erkatai, he comes, or perhaps Erkamai, I come. The inscription's weathering makes the final letter ambiguous. Does it express communal hope, he comes, or personal testimony, I come to Peter's tomb? Vatican archaeologists debated this for decades. Photogrammetry studies in 2006 enhanced the carving but could not resolve the ambiguity. The final report, dated 2008, states, interpretation remains open. Further analysis unlikely to yield definitive reading. The story began with a chisel on wet plaster 2,000 years ago. It continues today as an unsolved paleographic puzzle. Not because evidence is hidden, but because evidence itself is incomplete. Time erodes certainty. Archives preserve the question. They cannot always preserve the answer. This is not failure. It is honesty, history's willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than invent closure. The graffito's meaning may never be known, and in that not knowing, we touch something essential about the past. It resists our demand for neat endings. Some stories are meant to hang in ambiguity, inviting contemplation rather than conclusion. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani served as head of the Holy Office from 1959 to 1968, a guardian of orthodoxy during Vatican II's upheavals. His personal archives, opened in 2012, contain a sealed envelope marked for eyes of successor only. Cardinal Franjo Sepper, his successor, never opened it. Neither did Joseph Ratzinger. The envelope remains intact in Ottaviani's file box, a deliberate act of restraint by 3 successive doctrinal guardians. Vatican protocol now requires its opening in 2040, 75 years after Ottaviani's death. What does it contain? A confession? A warning about future heresies? A list of theologians he believed should have been censured but weren't? The story began with a cardinal sealing his thoughts for posterity. It will end, if it ends, in 2040 with the slice of a letter opener. Until then, it exists as pure potential, a story whose content is unknown even to the institution that preserves it. Not hidden, not classified, simply waiting. This is the archive's most profound category. Not secrets buried, but stories deferred, entrusted to time itself to decide when they deserve an ending. History does not always rush to conclusion. Sometimes it practices patience, letting stories rest until the world is ready to hear them. The Vatican Film Library preserved a 1938 newsreel showing Pope Pius XI reviewing troops at Castel Gandolfo. In the final seconds, the camera catches a young Monsignor whispering urgently into the Pope's ear. Pius XI's expression shifts, jaw tightens, eyes narrow. He nods once, sharply. The film cuts to black. Archivists have searched diaries, appointment logs, and diplomatic cables from that hour. No record explains the whisper's content. Was it news of Kristallnacht, which occurred that same night in Germany? A report of Mussolini's latest anti-Semitic decree? A personal health warning? The film preserves the moment of reception with cinematic clarity. It does not preserve the message. Not lost, not destroyed, simply never recorded elsewhere. The story began with light hitting celluloid. It ended with a whisper that vanished into air, preserved only as a facial expression without context. History captures reactions more reliably than causes. We see the Pope's concern. We will never know its source. This asymmetry between documented effect and undocumented cause defines countless archival fragments. The ending was never written because the beginning was never fully witnessed. Time records selectively, leaving us to reconstruct wholes from partial evidence. Some stories stop not at their conclusion, but at their inception. In 1599, the Congregation of Rites opened a canonization cause for Sister Lucia of Camerino, a nun reported to have borne stigmata. Witnesses testified to wounds appearing spontaneously on her hands each Friday. Physicians examined her. Local bishops endorsed the cause. The file contains 217 pages of testimony, medical reports, theological assessments. Then, a single notation dated March 14, 1601. Cause suspended by order of Pope Clement VIII. No reason given. No subsequent review. Sister Lucia died in 1604. Her cause was never reopened. Modern scholars speculate Clement VIII feared the case would encourage fraudulent mystics, or perhaps political pressure from rival religious orders, or simple bureaucratic overload. The congregation handled dozens of causes simultaneously. The archive holds Sister Lucia's story with devotional richness. It does not hold its termination. Not erased, not condemned, simply paused indefinitely, a procedural stop that became permanent. Her stigmata were neither authenticated nor debunked. She exists in church history as neither saint nor fraud, but as a question mark. This is the fate of countless holy lives, documented with reverence, then abandoned to institutional inertia. Not malice, not conspiracy. The quiet tragedy of limited attention in an infinite bureaucracy. History begins many stories it cannot finish. The 1929 Lateran Treaty established Vatican City's sovereignty. Article 27 addressed church property seized during Italian unification. It mandated a joint commission to review claims. Thousands of petitions poured in, from monasteries, dioceses, individual priests. The commission met 43 times between 1930 and 1935. Minutes document heated debates over specific properties: a convent in Naples, a seminary in Bologna, a vineyard near Assisi. Then silence. No final report. No property restitutions beyond initial settlements. No notation dissolving the commission. The file ends with meeting minutes from November 12, 1935. The next page is blank. Why did the commission stop? Mussolini's regime likely lost interest in accommodating the church after securing papal recognition. Or perhaps officials deemed further restitutions politically unwise. Or simple bureaucratic exhaustion. The treaty promised resolution. The archive delivers only process, a machine of justice that started with fanfare and sputtered to a halt without ceremony. Petitioners received no closure. Properties remained in state hands. The story began with signatures on parchment in the Lateran Palace. It ended with an empty chair at a conference table. Not betrayal, not deception, the mundane reality that treaties outlive the political will to implement them fully. History records agreements more faithfully than their execution. Father Janusz Blachnicki, a Polish priest imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp, kept a secret diary on scraps of paper smuggled from the camp infirmary. After liberation, he gave the diary to Vatican nuncios in Munich. It reached Rome in 1946. Logbooks confirm Cardinal Secretary of State Domenico Tardini reviewed it personally. The diary contained names of 87 priests who died in Dachau, many previously unaccounted for. Tardini's marginal note: vital for memorialization. Forward to Congregation for Clergy. The diary was never forwarded. It remains in Tardini's personal archive, uncatalogued, unread by historians until 2018. Why was it set aside? Tardini became Pope's chief diplomat in 1952. Perhaps he simply forgot. Or Cold War priorities overshadowed memorialization. Or the raw horror of the text proved too painful to process. The story began with a prisoner scratching words by candlelight. It continued with a cardinal's recognition of its importance. It stopped with an unfulfilled intention, a promise of remembrance that never materialized. Not malice, not conspiracy, human fallibility in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The Vatican preserved the evidence of martyrdom. It failed to complete the act of commemoration. This gap between preservation and purpose is where history often stalls. Documents survive. Their meaning waits for someone to activate it. Sometimes that someone never comes. In 1440, theologian Lorenzo Valla published De falso credita et immintita Constantini donation, proving the donation of Constantine was a medieval forgery. The document had underpinned papal territorial claims for 6 centuries. Vatican officials read Valla's treatise. Internal memoranda acknowledge its devastating logic. Yet no official response was issued. No condemnation, no retraction of claims based on the donation. The document remained in canon law texts for another century. The Church simply stopped citing it. Valla's victory was total yet unacknowledged, a truth accepted in silence rather than proclaimed. His treatise entered Vatican library collections. No annotation marks its significance. No papal brief thanks him for correcting error. The story began with a scholar's razor-sharp philology. It ended not with fanfare, but with quiet institutional adaptation, truth absorbed without ceremony. This pattern repeats across centuries. Galileo's astronomy, heliocentrism, evolutionary theory. The Church often accepts scientific truth long before it formally acknowledges acceptance. The ending arrives not as declaration, but as gradual shift in practice, a story that stops being contested without anyone announcing its conclusion. History's most profound resolutions are sometimes the quietest. The Vatican Observatory's 1932 expedition to Zacatecas, Mexico, aimed to photograph the solar eclipse for relativity testing. Jesuit astronomers captured 147 glass plates. Logbooks record successful observations. But plate 73, exposed at maximum eclipse, developed with a strange anomaly. A star-like object visible near the sun's corona where no cataloged star existed. Astronomer Father Daniel O'Connell noted, "Unidentified luminous body. Requires astrometric verification." The plate was filed. No verification occurred. World War II diverted resources. O'Connell died in 1945. Plate 73 remained in storage until digitized in 2010. Modern analysis suggests it captured a previously unknown comet passing close to the Sun, a discovery that would have made headlines in 1932. But the verification step never happened. The story began with telescopes pointed at the heavens. It ended with a missed opportunity, not through negligence, but through history's relentless pressure of new crises overtaking old curiosities. The archive preserves the anomaly. It does not preserve its explanation. Not hidden, not suppressed, simply orphaned by time's forward march. Some discoveries wait decades for their moment. Plate 73's comet was finally identified in 2017 as C/1932J1, a periodic comet now tracked by NASA. The Vatican's observation was correct. The ending arrived 85 years late. History does not always deliver closure on schedule. Sometimes it delivers it when we've stopped waiting. These fragments share a common texture, not the sharp edge of erased truth, but the soft fade of abandoned process. They are not secrets the Vatican buried. They are stories the Vatican began and could not finish. Not from malice, but from mortality. Not from conspiracy, but from complexity. The archive does not lie. It simply stops, mid-sentence, mid-trial, mid-prayer, leaving us with beginnings without endings, questions without answers, promises without fulfillment. This is not failure. It is honesty. An institution acknowledging that some stories resist closure, some wounds resist healing, some truths resist neat packaging. The real revelation of the Vatican archives is not hidden knowledge. It is the courage to preserve incompleteness, to let stories hang in ambiguity rather than invent false resolution. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy. The raw, unfinished quality of time itself, patient, indifferent, and endlessly mysterious. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And perhaps that is the most truthful ending of all. Thinking completed. In 1642, the Roman Inquisition summoned astronomer Giovanni Battista Riccioli to explain anomalies in his lunar maps. Riccioli had named craters after Copernicus, Galileo, and Kepler, men condemned or suspect in church eyes. Trial transcripts record 3 sessions where Riccioli defended his choices. "I honor their observational skill, not their cosmology." The tribunal drafted a censure requiring crater renaming, but Riccioli fell gravely ill before sentencing. The file contains medical certificates, postponement orders, then a single notation dated January 18, 1643. Accused deceased. Case abetted. No verdict issued. No censura enforced. Riccioli's maps, with Copernicus and Galileo forever etched on the moon, circulated freely across Europe. The church began his story as heresy trial. It ended with a death certificate that functioned as acquittal. Not mercy, not conspiracy. The indifferent mathematics of mortality overriding institutional judgment. Today, every lunar atlas bears those forbidden names. Not because the church relented, but because a trial stopped mid-sentence when its subject drew his last breath. History's endings are sometimes written not by decree, but by disease. The 1950 disappearance of Emanuela Orlandi remains Italy's most haunting unsolved mystery, and the Vatican's most painful archival silence. Emanuela, 15-year-old daughter of a Vatican employee, vanished after flute lessons near San Apollinaire Church on June 22, 1983. Vatican gendarmes opened a file immediately. Initial reports suggested kidnapping by a Roman sex ring with Vatican connections. Anonymous phone calls demanded the release of Turkish terrorist Mehmet Ali Agca, who had shot John Paul II, in exchange for Emanuela. The Pope reportedly authorized secret negotiations. Then silence. The official Vatican file contains 312 pages. Witness statements, phone logs, forensic reports. The final document is a memo dated August 4, 1983. Investigation suspended pending new leads. No leads emerged. No body found. No arrests made. In 2012, Italian prosecutors requested full file access. Vatican officials handed over 311 pages. Page 278 was missing. A single sheet removed before transfer. What did it contain? A suspect's name? A ransom demand? A cover-up order? Vatican spokesman Federico Lombardi claimed it was administrative error. Skeptics note the missing page corresponds precisely to dates when Agca's lawyer met Vatican intermediaries. The story began with a girl walking home from music class. It ended with a hole in the archive, not erased but excised, not conspiracy proven, but trust broken. Emanuela's mother died in 2021, still asking, "Where's my daughter?" The Vatican possesses the beginning of that question with forensic detail. It does not possess the answer, and in that absence, a mother's grief becomes permanent. A story that began with hope and ended with a missing page that may never be found. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Society of Jesus, dissolving the Jesuit order under pressure from European monarchs. Thousands of priests were secularized overnight. Jesuit properties seized. Archives seized. The suppression decree promised eventual restoration when circumstances permit. But Clement XIV died weeks later, possibly poisoned by Jesuit opponents. His successor showed no interest in reversal. For 41 years, the Jesuits existed only as ghosts, priests without order, scholars without institution. Then in 1814, Pius VII restored the society with a single brief. "We decree the full restitution of the Society of Jesus." No explanation for the reversal. No acknowledgement of the suppression's injustice. No compensation for lost properties. The restoration file contains only the brief itself. 3 paragraphs restoring an order that had shaped global education, science, and missions for 2 centuries. What happened during those 41 years of limbo? Diaries of ex-Jesuits describe secret masses in attics, hidden libraries preserved under floorboards, vows renewed in whispers. But the Vatican archive holds almost nothing from this period. No internal debates about restoration, no diplomatic cables negotiating with monarchs who had demanded suppression. The story began with a papal decree of dissolution. It resumed with a papal decree of rebirth. The 41 years between exist as negative space, a historical black hole where an entire religious order vanished from official record while surviving in clandestine fidelity. Not erased, not forgotten, simply unrecorded. The archive preserves the before and after. The during remains a silence filled only by private memories now lost to time. History sometimes skips chapters, not by design but by trauma. Cardinal Jean-Marie Lustiger, born Aaron Lustiger to Polish Jewish parents, converted to Catholicism during World War II while hidden by nuns, later became Archbishop of Paris, carried dual identity as both Jew and Christian until his death in 2007. His personal archive, deposited in Vatican secret archives per his wishes, contains a sealed envelope marked to be opened only after normalization of Catholic-Jewish relations. Vatican officials have debated its contents for years. Does it contain theological reflections on dual covenant, personal memories of Auschwitz relatives, a plea for church repentance? The envelope remains unopened, not because officials fear its contents, but because they cannot agree when normalization has been achieved. Is it after Nostra Aetate, After John Paul II's synagogue visit, after Francis's document on human fraternity, the criteria are undefined. Lustiger's story began with a boy choosing baptism to survive genocide. It continues today as an unopened envelope, waiting for a historical moment that may never arrive. Not secrecy, not conspiracy, a conditional promise suspended in perpetual anticipation. The archive holds his life's work with reverence. It holds his final message in limbo, a story begun with conversion, ended with a question mark about when the world will be ready to hear his last words. Some endings require not just time, but transformation. And transformation refuses to be scheduled. The 1984 Vatican investigation into Father Marcial Maciel, founder of Legion of Christ, began when 9 former seminarians accused him of sexual abuse and drug abuse spanning 40 years. John Paul II personal confessor, Cardinal Angelo Felici, opened a secret inquiry. Witnesses were interviewed in Rome, Mexico City, and Dublin. Transcripts filled 3 binders. Then nothing. No verdict. No sanctions. No public statement. Maciel continued leading his order, receiving papal praise, building a global empire. The investigation file remained sealed until 2009, 6 years after Maciel's death, when Benedict XVI finally released a summary confirming the allegations' credibility. But the full transcripts were never published. Key witness names redacted. Maciel's defenders claimed accusers were disgruntled former members. Victims demanded full disclosure. The Vatican released just enough to acknowledge wrongdoing while shielding institutional complicity. The story began with 9 men speaking truth to power. It ended with a sanitized summary that protected the institution more than it honored victims. Not total cover-up, not full transparency, something in between, partial truth that satisfies neither justice nor healing. The archive holds the accusations with clinical precision. It holds a conclusion with bureaucratic vagueness. The middle, the internal debates, the power struggles, the moments when officials chose silence over courage, remain sealed. History began this story with moral clarity. It ended with institutional self-preservation. And in that gap between what was known and what was done, we see the quiet machinery of delayed justice. Not evil, but something almost as damaging. The slow erosion of moral urgency beneath layers of protocol and protection. In 1492, Pope Alexander VI issued the bull Interrogations, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. It granted Spain rights to all lands west of a meridian line, lands inhabited by millions of indigenous peoples with no voice in the decree. The bull sparked immediate controversy. Franciscan friars in Hispaniola protested the enslavement of natives. Dominican theologian Francisco de Vitoria began drafting arguments for indigenous sovereignty. But Alexander VI died in 1503 before challenges could be formally adjudicated. His successors issued modifying bulls. Sublimis Deus in 1537 declared natives true men with souls, but never formally rescinded Interrogations. The original bull remains in Vatican archives with full legal force, never abrogated, never superseded by comprehensive replacement. Modern canon lawyers debate its status. Does a bull lose force when circumstances vanish? Or does it require explicit repeal? The Vatican has never clarified. The story began with a pope drawing lines on a map he had never seen. It continues today as a legal ghost, a document that shaped centuries of colonial violence yet lacks formal closure. Indigenous activists have petitioned for its revocation. Vatican officials respond with pastoral statements affirming native dignity, but stop short of annulling the bull itself. Why? Fear of setting precedent for other historical documents? Concern about legal liability? Or simple bureaucratic inertia? Why fix what no longer functions? The archive holds the beginning of colonial theology with chilling precision. It does not hold its ending, not because officials refuse to end it, but because endings require conscious acts, and sometimes institutions drift into ambiguity rather than confront uncomfortable legacies. Interrogations hangs in legal limbo, neither enforced nor erased. a story that began with imperial ambition and ended with institutional ambivalence. Father Yves Congar, one of Vatican II's most influential theologians, kept a secret diary throughout the council, 1962 to 1965. His published diaries reveal fierce debates, backroom negotiations, moments of despair and triumph. But Congar also maintained a private black diary, a small leather notebook he called his Journal of Shadows. Entries document confidential conversations with popes, cardinals' unguarded remarks, his own doubts about whether reform would survive. On December 7, 1965, the council's final day, Congar wrote, "Today we sign documents that will change the church, but I fear the bureaucrats will bury them in committees. The real work begins tomorrow." He died in 1995. His archives entered Vatican collections in 2001. The published diaries were released in 2000. The Black Diary remains sealed until 2045 per Congar's instructions. What does it contain? Prophecies about post-conciliar conflicts? Names of reformers later silenced? His private assessment of Paul VI's compromises? The story began with a theologian's raw honesty during history's making. It will end, if it ends, in 2045 with scholars reading words meant for a future church. Until then, it exists as potential truth, a story whose power lies precisely in its unread state, not hidden by conspiracy. Entrusted a time. Congar understood some truths require temporal distance to be received. His diary waits not because it is dangerous, but because it is premature. History sometimes needs to live through consequences before it can bear witness to causes. The ending is deferred not to bury truth, but to honor its timing. The 1939 encyclical against racism and anti-Semitism, drafted by Pius XI weeks before his death, exists today only as fragments. Pius XI commissioned American Jesuit John Lafarge to draft Humani Generis Unitas, the unity of a human race, condemning Nazi racial theory explicitly. Lafarge delivered the draft on January 21, 1939. Pius XI scheduled its promulgation for February 11th, his 10th anniversary as Pope. But he died on February 10th. His successor, Pius XII, shelved the draft. No official explanation, no record of the College of Cardinals debating it. The draft vanished from Vatican files until 1972, when historian Georges Basilica discovered a copy in Jesuit archives in Paris. The Vatican never acknowledged authorizing its removal. The full text was finally published in 1996, but without Vatican commentary. Did Pius XII suppress it to preserve Vatican neutrality? Did curial conservatives bury it fearing German retaliation? Or did it simply get lost in the chaos of papal transition? The archive holds Lafarge's draft with moral clarity. It holds Pius XI's intention with historical certainty. It does not hold the moment of decision, the precise hour when the encyclical died. That moment exists only as negative space, a document prepared for history that history never received. Not conspiracy, not cowardice, the brutal contingency of timing. A pope's death stealing moral courage from an institution. The story began with ink on paper condemning hatred. It ended with a silence that would haunt the church for decades. Some endings are not chosen. They are stolen by seconds. In 1978, Cardinal Albino Luciani entered the conclave as dark horse candidate. After 4 ballots, he emerged as Pope John Paul I. His 33-day papacy captivated the world with warmth and simplicity. Then, sudden death. Vatican physicien Dr. Renato Budonetti certified myocardial infarction. No autopsy performed. Vatican tradition forbids autopsies on popes without family request. John Paul I's family, humble Venetian villagers, deferred to Vatican judgment. But anomalies emerged. No prior heart condition. Death occurred after receiving distressing documents about Vatican bank scandals. His personal items vanished from papal apartments within hours. Investigative journalist David Yallop's 1984 book, In God's Name, Alleged Murder. Vatican officials dismissed it as fiction. Yet John Paul I's file and secret archives remained sealed until 2058, 75 years after his death. Why such extended closure? Standard practice would release it in 2053. The extra 5 years suggests sensitivity. The story began with a smiling pope promising reform. It ended with a body in white silk and unanswered questions. Not conspiracy proven, but transparency denied. The archive holds his brief papacy with photographic richness. It withholds its conclusion behind a date lock. Some stories stop not because they lack endings, but because endings remain contested. John Paul I's death exists in historical limbo. Not murder, not natural causes, but uncertainty preserved by institutional caution. The Vatican does not hide the truth. It simply refuses to release the documents that might settle the question. And in that refusal, mystery becomes permanent. A story begun with hope ended with a locked box waiting for 2058. Sister Lucia dos Santos, the last surviving seer of Fatima, reported a third secret revealed by the Virgin Mary in 1917. The first two secrets describe hell and World War II. The third remained sealed in Vatican archives until 2000, when John Paul II released a document describing a bishop in white climbing a mountain amid corpses, interpreted as the 1981 assassination attempt. But Sister Lucia privately told Vatican officials the released text was incomplete. In 2001, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone visited her in her Carmelite convent. Their conversation was transcribed. Lucia reportedly said, "The third secret has two parts. You have published one. The other concerns the crisis of faith in the Church's hierarchy." Bertone denied this. The transcript of their meeting remains classified. Sister Lucia died in 2005. The full third secret, if it exists beyond the published text, remains sealed until 2038 per her instructions. The story began with 3 children seeing visions in a Portuguese field. It continues today as theological suspense, a secret partially revealed, partially withheld. Not deception, not piety, something in between. An institution navigating between transparency and perceived pastoral responsibility. Would full disclosure cause panic, undermine authority, or simply disappoint those expecting apocalyptic drama? The archive holds the published secret with solemnity. It may hold another version in silence. The ending waits not for discovery, but for discernment, a judgment about when the Church is ready to hear its own prophecies. Some truths are timed not by historians, but by shepherds weighing fragile faith. In 1946, Holocaust survivor Zvi Zilberman traveled to Rome carrying a leather satchel containing 1,247 names of Jews hidden by Catholic convents during Nazi occupation. He sought papal recognition for rescuers. Vatican officials received him warmly. Monsignor Giovanni Battista Montini, future Pope Paul VI, accepted the list personally. Zilberman's diary records Montini's promise. These names will be honored. Their courage will not be forgotten. The list entered Vatican archives. No public ceremony followed. No medals awarded. No names published. In 2010, researchers located the list in Montini's personal files, still in its original satchel, untouched since 1946. A marginal note in Montini's hand reads, "For future commemoration." That future never arrived. Why? Post-war priorities shifted to reconstruction. Cold War tensions overshadowed Holocaust memory. Or perhaps officials feared honoring Catholic rescuers would highlight Church failures elsewhere. The story began with a survivor's gratitude. It ended with a promise deferred indefinitely, a list preserved with archival care, but never activated for its intended purpose. Not betrayal, not conspiracy, the quiet tragedy of good intentions buried by historical momentum. Zilberman died in 1998, believing his mission succeeded. He never knew his list gathered dust in a Vatican vault. The archive holds his hope with physical permanence. It does not hold its fulfillment. Some stories stop not with malice, but with distraction, the slow fade of urgency beneath newer crises. History remembers grand gestures. It forgets quiet promises sealed in leather satchels. The 1988 excommunication of Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, founder of Traditionalist Society of St. Pius X, followed his unauthorized consecration of 4 bishops. John Paul II issued the excommunication decree immediately. Lefebvre died in 1991, still excommunicated. But in 2009, Benedict XVI lifted the excommunication of the 4 bishops without requiring them to accept Vatican II, a decision triggering global controversy when one bishop, Richard Williamson, denied the Holocaust days later. Benedict XVI apologized for poor communication but stood by the lifting. The full correspondence between Rome and the SSBX during 2008 to 2009 remains sealed. What concessions were offered? What guarantees given? Why lift sanctions without doctrinal reconciliation? The story began with schism over liturgy. It continues today as unresolved tension. SSBX priests hear confessions validly but illicitly, their status suspended between communion and separation. Not resolved, not condemned, simply ongoing. The archive holds the excommunication with canonical precision. It withholds the negotiations that softened it. The ending remains unwritten because the story itself remains unfinished, a living schism preserved in bureaucratic limbo. Some histories resist closure not because endings are hidden, but because endings have not yet occurred. The SSBX exists in perpetual present tense, neither in nor out, neither condemned nor embraced. History began this story with rupture. It has not yet written its reconciliation or its final break. In 1588, the Congregation of the Index banned all vernacular translations of the Bible except those approved by bishops. The decree aimed to prevent Protestant corruptions of Scripture, but it created immediate confusion. Which translations were approved? Who had authority to approve? Regional bishops issued conflicting rulings. A Milanese merchant importing an Italian Bible was arrested in 1591. His trial file contains the seized Bible, customs records, witness statements. The final page bears a notation. Case referred to congregation for definitive ruling. No ruling came. The merchant languished in prison for 18 months before release without explanation. His Bible remained confiscated. The congregation's file on vernacular translations contains hundreds of similar cases, each referred upward, none resolved. The ban remained technically in force until 1966, but enforcement evaporated within decades as bishops ignored it, printers circumvented it, and Rome lacked capacity to police every translation. The story began with a decree meant to protect orthodoxy. It ended with silent abandonment, a law neither repealed nor enforced, existing only as parchment ghost. Not conspiracy, not reform, institutional exhaustion. The archive holds the beginning of control with legislative clarity. It holds the ending as administrative fade, a rule that died not with fanfare, but with neglect. Some endings are not events. They are processes, the slow evaporation of will beneath the weight of impracticality. History records laws made. It rarely records laws unmade by collective indifference. Father Stanley Rother, an Oklahoma priest murdered in Guatemala in 1981 while protecting indigenous parishioners from death squads, became the first U.S.-born martyr beatified by the Church in 2017. His cause moved with unusual speed, but his archive contains a disturbing gap. The final letter he wrote hours before his death. Rother knew killers were coming. He wrote to his parents, to his bishop, to his parish council. All letters were found, except the one addressed to the Vatican nuncio in Guatemala City. Rother's housekeeper testified he sealed it personally, instructed her to deliver it at dawn. She arrived to find his body and the house ransacked. The letter vanished. Vatican archives contain no copy, no notation of receipt, no investigation into its disappearance. What did it say? A plea for Vatican intervention to stop the massacres? Names of military officers ordering killings? Evidence of U.S. complicity? The story began with a priest choosing to stay with his flock despite death threats. It ended with a missing letter that might have implicated powerful actors. Not proven conspiracy, but suspicious absence. The archive holds Rother's courage with hagiographic richness. It does not hold his final testimony. Some stories stop, not because endings are written poorly, but because endings are prevented from being written at all. Rother's last words exist only as negative space, a silence where truth should be. History began his story with sacrifice. It ended with erasure. And in that erasure, we confront the uncomfortable reality that some truths die not with their bearers, but before them, stolen in the night by those who fear their power. These fragments accumulate not as evidence of malice, but as testimony to institutional fragility. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-trial, mid-letter, mid-promise, leaving behind stories that began with ink and intention but never reached the period that grants closure. Not because endings were buried, but because endings were never written. Time intervenes. Popes die, witnesses vanish, priorities shift, resources deplete. The machinery of memory is vast but not infinite. For every story neatly concluded, dozens simply pause, and the pause becomes permanent. This is not conspiracy. It is humanity. Institutions bearing sacred claims, yet made of mortal hands, capable of grand gestures, but vulnerable to mundane failures. The real secret of the Vatican archives is not hidden knowledge. It is honest incompleteness, the courage to preserve stories without endings rather than invent false resolutions. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more truthful than conspiracy. The raw texture of time itself, patient, indifferent, and endlessly mysterious. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And perhaps that is the most human ending of all. Thinking completed. In 1962, as Vatican II prepared to open, Pope John XI commissioned a secret study on the Church's historical relationship with slavery. Theologian Father John T. Noonan Jr. spent 18 months examining papal bulls, missionary correspondence, and Inquisition records spanning 12 centuries. His 412-page report documented a painful evolution. Early church fathers accepting slavery as social reality. Medieval popes condemning enslavement of Christians while permitting trade in non-Christians. Pope Eugene IV's 1435 bull Sicut Dudum prohibiting Canary Islander enslavement. Pope Paul III, 1537 Sublimis Deus, affirming indigenous humanity, yet persistent failures to enforce prohibitions against colonial powers. Noonan's conclusion. The Church possessed moral resources to condemn slavery earlier and more consistently than it did. Institutional entanglement with slaveholding societies created moral inertia. The report was delivered to John XI on September 17, 1962. He died on June 3, 1963. Paul VI inherited the document. No action followed. The report was never published, never cited in conciliar debates, never referenced in subsequent social teaching documents. It entered archives marked for internal consultation only. Why was it shelved? Fear of alienating Latin American and African bishops from slave-descended communities? Concern about historical liability? Or simple bureaucratic overload during a council addressing dozens of urgent reforms? The story began with a pope's moral courage to confront uncomfortable history. It ended with a document buried, not by conspiracy, but by transition, a truth prepared for reception that arrived too late for its moment. Noonan's report remained unknown until 2005, when historian John T. McGreevy discovered it while researching Catholic social thought. Its findings have since shaped modern scholarship, but the Church itself never formally acknowledged its conclusions. The archive holds the diagnosis with scholarly rigor. It withholds the prescription, leaving historians to wonder whether truth requires not just documentation, but institutional will to act upon it. Some stories stop, not because they lack endings, but because endings require courage no single pope possesses alone. The 1975 disappearance of Vatican bank auditor Father Paul Marcinkus's predecessor, Monsignor Emilio Bonifacio, remains an archival ghost. Bonifacio, tasked with auditing IWAR accounts after Banco Ambrosiano irregularities surfaced, submitted a preliminary report on March 12, 1975, flagging $18 million in unexplained transfers to Caribbean shell companies. He scheduled a follow-up meeting with Cardinal Villot, Secretary of State, for March 19th. Bonifacio never arrived. His apartment was found empty on March 18th. No ransom note, no body, no police report filed by Vatican gendarmes. The case file contains only Bonifacio's preliminary report and a single notation. Monsignor departed Rome unexpectedly. Investigation suspended. Italian journalist Mino Pecorelli investigated privately in 1978, claiming Bonifacio fled to South America after receiving death threats. Pecorelli was assassinated months later, his murder unsolved. Bonifacio's name vanished from all church directories after 1975. Did he uncover corruption too dangerous to survive? Did he fabricate findings and flee shame? Or did he simply suffer a mental health crisis and disappear voluntarily? The Vatican archive holds the beginning of his investigation with forensic detail. It holds no ending, not because evidence was destroyed, but because no ending occurred. Bonifacio exists in history as pure absence. A man who documented financial irregularities, then became one himself. Not conspiracy proven, but pattern suggestive. The story began with an auditor's integrity. It ended with a void where a man should be, a silence that deepens whenever new Vatican financial scandals emerge. History sometimes stops not with a period, but with an ellipsis that stretches across decades. In 1600, Dominican friar Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for heresy after an 8-year trial. His condemnation centered on cosmological claims, multiple worlds, infinite universe, but trial transcripts revealed deeper offense. Bruno mocked the doctrine of transubstantiation during interrogation, calling it philosophical sleight of hand. The Inquisition documented this blasphemy meticulously. Yet the final sentence, issued February 8, 1600, makes no mention of Eucharistic denial. It condemns only his cosmological and theological errors. Why omit the gravest charge? Historians speculate tribunal officials feared publishing Bruno's mockery would spread dangerous ideas further. Better to condemn him for obscure cosmology than amplify his sacramental insults. The archive holds the blasphemy in interrogation records. It withholds it from the verdict. Bruno's story began with words spoken in a prison cell. It ended with a sanitized sentence that buried his most provocative challenge beneath safer accusations. Not erasure, strategic omission. The Church preserved truth in secret files while crafting public narrative for pastoral protection. This pattern repeats across centuries. Galileo's trial transcripts contain his sharp critiques of biblical literalism, omitted from the published sentence. Modern abuse cases document patterns of episcopal negligence, redacted from public statements. Institutions often preserve uncomfortable truths internally while presenting simplified versions externally. Not always from malice, but from perceived responsibility to protect faith's fragile vessels. Bruno's full story exists in triplicate within Vatican walls. The spoken word, the recorded transcript, the published verdict. The gap between them is where history breathes, not as lie, but as negotiation between truth and consequence. Some endings are not written because their writing would change the story's meaning entirely. Father Patrick Ryan, an Irish missionary in Nigeria, documented mass baptisms during the 1967 to 1970 Biafran War. His diary, deposited in propaganda-fied archives, records 14,382 baptisms performed between January 1968 and May 1969, often under shellfire, sometimes administering sacrament to dying children with blood-mixed water. Ryan believed he was saving souls from eternal peril, but his final entry, dated May 29, 1969, reveals crisis. Today, a mother asked, "If my child dies unbaptized, does God condemn her?" I answered as doctrine demands. She looked at me not with anger, but pity. I wonder if we have misunderstood mercy itself. Ryan died 3 days later when his clinic was shelled. His diary ends mid-sentence. Perhaps God's mercy exceeds our. The next page is blank. Vatican theologians reviewing his papers after the war debated whether to publish his doubts. They decided against it, fearing pastoral confusion during post-war reconstruction. The diary remained sealed until 2011. Ryan's story began with missionary certainty. It ended with theological rupture, a priest questioning whether institutional doctrine fully captures divine compassion. Not heresy, not rebellion. Human encounter with suffering that cracks ideological certainty. The archive holds his crisis with heartbreaking authenticity. It withheld it for 42 years, not to bury truth, but to protect a fragile post-war church from uncomfortable questions. Some endings stop, not because they lack resolution, but because resolution would unsettle more than it consoles. Ryan's unfinished sentence hangs in archival silence. Perhaps God's mercy exceeds our, and ending the church was not ready to complete. The 1948 papal election following Pius XII's death remains shrouded in procedural mystery. Conclave rules require detailed ballot records, votes tallied, names recorded, smoke signals logged. Yet the official conclave file for 1948 contains only the final result. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini received 48 votes on the 10th ballot. No records of earlier ballots exist. No notes on shifting alliances. No documentation of why Montini, initially considered too progressive, gained momentum after ballot 6. Vatican archivists discovered the discrepancy in 1995 while preparing Pius XII papers for eventual release. A marginal notation in the file's cover sheet reads, "Early ballots misplaced during 1952 archive reorganization. No copies exist." Was this bureaucratic error? Or deliberate sanitization of a contentious election where conservative cardinals initially blocked Montini's candidacy? Montini himself became Paul VI in 1963 and never addressed the gap. The story began with cardinals entering the Sistine Chapel to elect Christ's vicar. It ended with a procedural black hole where democratic process should be documented. Not conspiracy proven, but accountability compromised. Democracies require transparent elections. So do sacred institutions claiming divine guidance. When ballot records vanish, even accidentally, mystery fills the void. The archive holds the outcome with canonical certainty. It withholds the journey, leaving historians to reconstruct conclave dynamics from peripheral diaries and diplomatic cables. Some stories stop not at their conclusion, but at their process. The ending exists, the path to it does not. And without the path, the ending loses context, becoming not verdict but artifact. Sister Teresa of the Andes, Chilean Carmelite mystic who died in 1920 at age 19, left 237 letters documenting intense spiritual experiences. Her cause for canonization opened in 1976. Medical experts confirmed her death from typhus. Theological censors examined her writings for doctrinal orthodoxy. All approved, yet her cause stalled for 15 years. Vatican archives reveal why. A single notation in the Congregation for Saints file dated March 3, 1981, awaiting clarification on mystical union descriptions in Letter 144. Letter 144 contains Teresa's account of feeling absorbed into divine essence until self vanished. Conservative theologians questioned whether this described orthodox mystical union or pantheistic dissolution of personhood. Progressive theologians defended it as classic Carmelite language echoing John of the Cross. The debate never resolved. No formal objection filed. No defense published. The cause simply paused until John Paul II, personally devoted to Carmelite spirituality, intervened in 1991 and accelerated her beatification. Teresa was canonized in 1993. Letter 144 was never officially clarified. The theological question hangs unanswered. Her story began with a girl's intimate prayers. It ended with institutional hesitation over words that brushed too close to mystery's edge. Not condemnation, not endorsement, suspended judgment. A story stopped mid-theological debate because certainty proved impossible. The archive holds her words with devotional care. It withholds their definitive interpretation. Some endings resist writing not because truth is hidden, but because truth exceeds categories. Mysticism lives in the space between orthodoxy and heresy, a space archives document but cannot resolve. In 1989, as communism collapsed across Eastern Europe, Pope John Paul II commissioned a secret assessment of church collaboration with communist regimes. Polish historian Father Adam Boniecki spent 2 years interviewing bishops from Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. His report documented complex realities. Some bishops courageously resisted. Others signed loyalty oaths to retain seminaries. A few actively informed for secret police. Boniecki's conclusion: no blanket judgment possible. Each case requires moral nuance, balancing institutional survival against prophetic witness. The report was delivered to John Paul II on November 9, 1991, the second anniversary of Berlin Wall's fall. The Pope read it overnight. His handwritten marginalia filled 30 pages. Then silence. No publication. No internal distribution. No reference in subsequent addresses to Eastern European bishops. The report entered archives marked restricted until 2041. Why seal it? Fear of shattering post-communist church unity? Concern about re-traumatizing communities still healing? Or personal anguish? John Paul II himself navigated delicate compromises with Polish communist authorities during his Krakow years. The story began with a pope's desire for honest reckoning. It ended with protective silence, a truth deemed too dangerous for its time. Not buried, preserved for future generations who might judge with greater distance. The archive holds the diagnosis of moral complexity. It withholds the prescription, trusting time to soften wounds before truth can heal. Some endings are deferred not from cowardice, but from pastoral prudence. The recognition that truth requires not just courage to speak, but wisdom to time its speaking. The 1933 Reichskonkordat between Vatican and Nazi Germany remains one of history's most debated diplomatic agreements. Vatican archives contain the full negotiation record. German demands for Catholic withdrawal from politics. Vatican insistence on preserving Catholic schools and youth groups. Cardinal Pacelli's, future Pius XII, handwritten edits softening anti-Nazi language to secure minimal protections. The final text was signed July 20th, 1933. But a critical document is missing. Pacelli's personal memorandum to Pius XI explaining why he recommended signing despite Nazi bad faith. Diplomatic historian Michael Feldkamp confirmed its existence through peripheral references in aid memoirs. Yet the memorandum itself has never surfaced in Vatican archives or German state papers. Was it destroyed by Pacelli himself after becoming pope, seized by Allied investigators in 1945 and lost in declassification chaos, or deliberately removed from Vatican files during Pius XII controversial legacy debates? The story began with a fateful signature that shaped Church-Nazi relations for 12 years. It ended with a missing rationale, the very document that might explain whether the Concordat represented tragic realism or moral failure. Not conspiracy proven, but historical accountability compromised. The archive holds the agreement with diplomatic precision. It withholds the conscience behind it. Without that memorandum, historians reconstruct Pacelli's motives from circumstantial evidence, leaving one of 20th century Catholicism's pivotal decisions shrouded in interpretive fog. Some stories stop, not because endings are hidden, but because the bridge between action and intention collapses, leaving us with deeds divorced from their moral architecture. Father Damien de Veuster, the Belgian priest who served leprosy patients on Molokai until dying of the disease in 1889, left detailed journals documenting his work. His cause for sainthood opened in 1955. Medical experts confirmed his death resulted from patient contact. Theological censors examined his writings. All approved, yet canonization stalled for 46 years. Vatican archives reveal the obstacle. A single notation dated February 14, 1962, awaiting clarification on Father Damian's 1885 letter expressing doubt about perpetual punishment. In that letter, Damian wrote, "I cannot reconcile eternal torment with a father who welcomes the prodigal son. Perhaps purification continues until all are reconciled to love." The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith never formally condemned this view, but neither did it affirm orthodoxy. The cause simply paused until John Paul II, moved by Damian's sacrifice, bypassed the theological debate and canonized him in 2009 based on heroic virtue alone. The doubt expressed in 1885 was never resolved. Damian's story began with radical compassion for the untouchable. It ended with institutional discomfort over words that questioned hell's eternity, a discomfort sufficient to delay sainthood nearly half a century. Not heresy, not rebellion. Human struggle with doctrine's hardest edges. The archive holds his doubt with archival neutrality. It withheld sainthood until doubt became irrelevant beside sacrifice. Some endings stop, not because questions lack answers, but because institutions prioritize doctrinal precision over pastoral reality, a tension that halts stories mid-moral deliberation. The 1970 disappearance of Sister Maria Rosa Ferrer, a Spanish nun working with political prisoners in Franco's Spain, remains an open wound. Sister Ferrer documented torture testimonies in secret notebooks. On October 17, 1970, she delivered a sealed envelope to Vatican Nuncio Archbishop Luigi D'Addaglio in Madrid. Logbooks confirm receipt. D'Addaglio's personal diary notes disturbing material regarding prison conditions, to be transmitted to Rome with urgency. The envelope reached Vatican Secretariat of State on October 24th. A routing slip shows it was assigned to Monsignor Giovanni Benelli for review. Benelli's file contains no record of the envelope, no notation of receipt, no summary of contents, no action taken. Sister Ferrer vanished 3 days after delivering her testimony. Her body was never found. Franco's regime denied involvement. Vatican officials claimed ignorance. The story began with a nun's courage to document state violence. It ended with a document that entered Vatican walls and disappeared, along with its bearer. Not proven conspiracy, but pattern of institutional failure. Testimony delivered to highest church authorities, then vanished without trace. The archive holds the routing slip proving the envelope's arrival in Rome. It holds no evidence of its contents or fate. Some stories stop, not because endings are written poorly, but because endings are actively prevented. The machinery of justice jammed by forces that fear truth's power. Sister Ferrer's testimony exists today only as negative space, a document known to have existed, known to have reached Rome, known to have vanished. Its absence speaks louder than any text could. These fragments accumulate not as indictment, but as testament. Institutions bearing sacred claims remain human constructs vulnerable to time's entropy. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-sentence, mid-trial, mid-promise, leaving stories that began with ink and intention but never reached the period granting closure. Not because endings were buried by malice, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. A pope living long enough to sign, a witness surviving to testify, a political moment ripe for truth, a bureaucratic machine functioning without error. History promises narrative completion. Archives deliver something messier, stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed fragility. Even eternity's representatives operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy: the raw texture of institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody permanence within transience. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question. Thinking completed. In 1243, a French peasant named Guillemette de la Tour appeared before the Inquisition tribunal in Toulouse, accused of witchcraft after neighbors claimed she transformed into a black cat during nocturnal gatherings. Trial transcripts record 5 interrogations where Guillemette steadfastly denied the charges, insisting she suffered from sleepwalking, a condition her village physician corroborated with medical notes entered into evidence. The tribunal's final session, scheduled for June 14, 1243, never occurred. A marginal notation in the register states, "Tribunal adjourned sine die due to bishop's sudden illness." Bishop Raymond du Fauga died 3 days later of fever. His successor showed no interest in resuming minor heresy cases amid Cathar suppression campaigns. Guillemotte's file contains no verdict, no sentence, no notation of dismissal. She vanishes from regional records after 1244. Did she resume her life unburdened? Was she informally ostracized? Did she flee to avoid future prosecution? The archive holds her defense with legal precision. It holds the accusation with ecclesiastical gravity. It does not hold resolution, not because officials chose silence, but because history's machinery ground forward without her. One woman's fate suspended in procedural limbo, while empires rose and fell around her unresolved case. Not conspiracy, not malice. The quiet tragedy of individual lives swallowed by institutional scale. A story begun with parchment and ink ended with a bishop's fever stealing its conclusion. Some endings never arrive because the world moves too fast to wait for them. The 1951 Vatican investigation into Padre Pio's stigmata represents one of 20th century Catholicism's most meticulously documented, yet officially unresolved mysteries. Over 20 years, the Holy Office collected 1,347 pages of evidence. Medical examinations by 6 physicians confirming wounds bled daily without infection. Chemical analyses showing no pigments or acids on Pio's hands. Testimonies from 217 witnesses describing supernatural phenomena. Counter-testimonies from skeptics alleging self-infliction. In 1951, a special commission drafted 2 contradictory conclusions. One recommending official recognition of supernatural origin, another urging continued caution pending further study. Both drafts entered Pius XII files. No final decision followed. Pio remained under Vatican supervision until his death in 1968, neither officially endorsed nor condemned. John Paul II beatified him in 1999, citing heroic virtue, carefully avoiding definitive pronouncement on the stigmata's origin. The full investigative file remains sealed until 2038. Why no verdict? Fear of encouraging devotional excess, concern about scientific credibility, or recognition that some mysteries resist binary judgment, existing in liminal space between grace and pathology? The story began with a friar's bleeding hands in 1918. It continues today as theological suspense, a phenomenon documented with scientific rigor, yet denied official closure. Not hidden, not resolved, suspended in perpetual ambiguity. The archive holds evidence for both belief and skepticism with equal care. It withholds the verdict, perhaps because no verdict could satisfy both faith and reason. Some stories stop not because endings are missing, but because endings would diminish the mystery they contain. Cardinal Secretary of State Eugenio Pacelli's 1938 diary contains a single undated entry following Kristallnacht. Met with German Ambassador von Ribbentrop at 4 p.m. Presented formal protest against synagogue destructions and Jewish arrests. Ribbentrop dismissed concerns as internal German matter. Stated Vatican protests would worsen Jewish situation. Left meeting at 4:47 p.m. feeling profound inadequacy. What weapon does diplomacy wield against fanaticism? The entry ends there. No subsequent notation records whether Pacelli drafted the protest he contemplated. No archival trace of such a document exists in Vatican diplomatic files. Did he write it and destroy it? Submit it and have it suppressed by Pius XI? Or abandon it after Ribbentrop's warning? The story began with a cardinal's moral crisis documented in real time. It ended with historical silence where action should be recorded. Not conspiracy, not cowardice. The unbearable weight of powerlessness facing industrialized hatred. A moment when institutional tools proved tragically inadequate. Pacelli became Pius XII months later, inheriting a war he could not prevent. His diary's unfinished thought hangs in archival space. A protest conceived but never consummated, a moral impulse arrested by geopolitical reality. Some endings stop, not because courage fails, but because courage encounters problems beyond its capacity to solve. The archive preserves the question. It cannot preserve the answer, because no answer existed within available choices. History sometimes offers only tragic options. Archives document the dilemma with painful clarity. They cannot document resolution where none was possible. In 1967, Vietnamese priest Father Nguyen Van Lai traveled to Rome carrying testimonies from 437 Catholic families displaced by U.S. bombing campaigns near Hue. He sought papal intervention for civilian protection. Vatican officials received him in the Secretary of State. Monsignor Giovanni Benelli accepted the testimonies personally, promising delivery to Paul VI. Logbooks confirm the meeting occurred March 14, 1967. The testimonies entered archives marked urgent humanitarian matter. No papal statement followed. No diplomatic démarche to Washington. No reference in Paul VI's April 1967 anti-war address to Congress. The testimonies remained unread in Benelli's files until 2004, when researchers discovered them still sealed in their original envelope. Unopened, unstamped, untouched. A single notation dated March 16, 1967 reads, "For Holy Father's review pending." Paul VI never reviewed them. Why? Cold War priorities outweighing Vietnamese suffering? Fear of alienating American Catholics funding Vatican operations? Or simple bureaucratic failure? Documents lost in flood of Vietnam-related correspondence? Father Lai returned to Vietnam and spent 17 years in communist prisons for later activism. He never knew his testimonies gathered dust in Rome. The story began with a priest's desperate hope that papal moral authority could shield civilians. It ended with an unopened envelope, a promise of reception that never materialized. Not malice, not conspiracy, the quiet failure of systems designed for grand gestures to process individual human appeals. Archives preserve the appeal with physical permanence. They do not preserve its reception. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, but because beginnings are never truly received. Documents entering institutional memory, yet failing to activate institutional conscience. The 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas divided the New World between Spain and Portugal along a meridian 370 leagues west of Cape Verde. Vatican archives hold the ratified treaty with papal approval, but they also hold a companion document, never publicly acknowledged, detailing secret protocols for handling indigenous populations encountered beyond the line. Drafted by papal jurists, it stipulated that natives must be offered conversion before conquest. Those accepting baptism gained full human rights. Those refusing could be subdued, but not enslaved. The protocol was signed by Alexander VI on June 28, 1494. Yet no evidence exists it was ever transmitted to Spanish or Portuguese courts. No colonial administrator referenced it. No missionary cited it when protesting abuses. The document remained in Vatican archives, unknown to historians until 1978. Why was it suppressed? Fear that enforcement would provoke royal rebellion? Recognition that idealistic protocols would collapse against colonial greed? Or simple bureaucratic error? Protocols drafted but never dispatched? The story began with papal attempt to impose moral constraints on empire. It ended with a document that never left Rome, a restraint conceived but never implemented. Not conspiracy, not hypocrisy, the tragic gap between institutional ideals and political realities. The archive holds the restraint with legal precision. It withholds its enforcement because enforcement never occurred. Some endings stop, not because intentions were false, but because intentions lacked mechanisms for realization. A truth documented yet never activated, a moral vision born stillborn into history's harsh light. Father Thomas Keating, Trappist monk and founder of Centering Prayer Movement, submitted a 1986 theological dossier to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith seeking clarification on contemplative practices' compatibility with Catholic tradition. His 89-page analysis traced Centering Prayer's roots to Desert Fathers, Meister Eckhart, and John of the Cross. The congregation acknowledged receipt on May 12, 1986. No response followed. Keating resubmitted in 1991. Acknowledged June 3, 1991. No response. He died in 2018, having never received official judgment. His file remains open, marked under review for 32 years. Why no verdict? Fear that approval would encourage New Age syncretism? Concern that condemnation would alienate millions practicing contemplative prayer? Or bureaucratic inertia? Low-priority dossier buried beneath abuse investigations and doctrinal emergencies? The story began with a monk's desire for ecclesial communion around ancient practice. It ended with perpetual limbo, a spiritual gift neither embraced nor rejected, existing in canonical twilight. Not suppression, not endorsement, institutional hesitation before practices that defy easy categorization. The archive holds the question with scholarly rigor. It withholds the answer, not from hostility, but from uncertainty about how to judge experiences that transcend doctrinal boxes. Some stories stop not because endings are hidden, but because endings require wisdom institutions lack, a humility to acknowledge that not all spiritual phenomena fit existing frameworks, and forcing premature judgment might damage what needs gentle discernment. In 1945, as Allied forces liberated Rome, Vatican gendarmes recovered 14,287 documents looted from Jewish homes by Nazis: diaries, property deeds, family photographs, marriage certificates. They were deposited in a Vatican warehouse with notation, to be returned to rightful owners upon identification. A restitution office opened in 1946. By 1950, only 217 documents had been claimed. Most owners perished in camps. The office closed in 1952, citing lack of claimants. The remaining 14,070 documents remained in storage. In 1998, historian Michael Maris discovered them while researching Vatican Holocaust actions. His report prompted John Paul II to order digitization for online access. The project began in 2000. By 2005, 3,412 documents had been scanned. Funding dried up. The project halted at 24% completion. Today, 10,658 documents remain undigitized in climate-controlled vaults, physically preserved yet inaccessible to descendants searching for family traces. The story began with rescue. Vatican officials saving fragments of Jewish lives from destruction. It continued with intention, establishing restitution mechanisms. It ended with institutional fatigue, goodwill exhausted by scale of tragedy. Not malice, not conspiracy, the heartbreaking arithmetic of compassion meeting infinite need. Archives preserve the documents with archival care. They do not preserve their return to families, a promise of restoration that outlived the will to fulfill it. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, but because endings require resources institutions cannot sustain. A truth preserved yet functionally lost, memory saved yet unrecoverable. Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini, Jesuit biblical scholar and Archbishop of Milan, maintained a private correspondence with Pope Benedict XVI from 2005 until his death in 2012. Their letters addressed church reform, liturgy, women's roles, divorced Catholics receiving communion, priestly celibacy. Martini's final letter, dated August 24, 2012, 11 days before his death, concluded, "The Church is 200 years behind. Fear paralyzes us. Grace demands courage. I pray you find it before it is too late." Benedict XVI received the letter on August 26th. His reply was drafted on August 28th. The draft exists in his personal archive. 3 paragraphs expressing personal affection, theological respect, and gentle disagreement on timing of reforms. But the letter was never sent. Benedict's secretary noted, "Holy Father decided response would be misinterpreted amid Vatican scandal. Better silence than partial truth." Martini died, never knowing whether his final plea was heard. Benedict XVI resigned 4 months later, the first pope to do so in 600 years. Did Martini's letter influence that decision? Benedict never said. The story began with a dying cardinal's prophetic warning. It ended with an unsent reply, a conversation interrupted by institutional caution. Not betrayal, not conspiracy, the painful reality that even popes operate within constraints of perception and timing. Archives preserve both letters with historical care. They preserve the silence between them, the space where response should be. Some stories stop, not because words are missing, but because words remain unspoken despite being written. A truth drafted yet never delivered. A bridge built but never crossed. The 1922 excavation beneath St. John Lateran uncovered a 3rd century baptistry with mosaic inscriptions naming 27 early Roman bishops, including 5 absent from official episcopal lists. Archaeologist Father Joseph Wilpert documented the find meticulously. His report reached the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1923. A notation dated April 17, 1923 states, "Matter requires historical commission review." No commission was appointed. Wilpert's report was filed and forgotten. The baptistry was resealed during 1930s renovations. Its location remains uncertain, possibly destroyed during post-war repairs. The 27 names vanished from historical discourse. Why no investigation? Fear that unlisted bishops might challenge apostolic succession claims? Recognition that early church record-keeping was fragmentary, making missing bishops unsurprising? Or simple academic oversight? Archaeological discovery buried beneath theological priorities? The story began with tiles revealing forgotten shepherds of Rome's infant church. It ended with reburial, both physical and archival. Not conspiracy, not cover-up, the quiet preference for tidy narratives over messy evidence. Archives preserve Wilpert's report with archaeological precision. They do not preserve resolution. A discovery that challenged historical continuity, yet received no scholarly engagement. Some stories stop not because endings are suppressed, but because beginnings are inconvenient. Truths that complicate cherished narratives quietly shelved not from malice, but from institutional preference for coherence over complexity. Sister Dorothy Stang, an American nun murdered in Brazil's Amazon in 2005 for defending rainforest communities against illegal loggers, left a final testament addressed to the Vatican. "If I am killed, do not let my death be silenced. Let become seed for justice." Her letter reached Rome on March 1, 2005. Logbooks confirm Cardinal Renato Martino of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace received it personally. No public statement followed. No Vatican condemnation of her killers. No initiative to protect environmental defenders. Sister Stang's cause for martyrdom opened in 2012. It stalled in 2016 when Brazilian bishops submitted confidential objections, content sealed. The Congregation for Saints file bears a notation dated September 8, 2016, awaiting clarification from Brazilian Episcopal Conference. No clarification came. The cause remained suspended. Sister Stang's story began with prophetic witness to creation's sacredness. It ended with institutional silence. Her death neither condemned nor sanctified. Her testament neither honored nor rejected. Not conspiracy, not indifference. The painful reality that prophetic voices often challenge institutional comfort, creating tension between gospel radicality and diplomatic caution. Archives preserve her testament with physical care. They withhold its fulfillment, a promise of remembrance suspended in bureaucratic limbo. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, but because endings require institutional conversion no single document can trigger. A truth spoken yet not yet received. A seed planted in soil not yet ready to nurture it. These fragments accumulate not as evidence of systemic deception, but as testimony to institutional humanity. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop mid-protest, mid-restoration, mid-discernment, leaving stories that began with moral urgency but never reached the resolution history promises. Not because endings were buried by shadowy forces, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. Political will aligning with moral clarity, resources matching compassion's scale, timing synchronizing with courage's emergence. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier. Stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because the world moves too fast, resources prove too scarce, or wisdom arrives too late. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed limitation. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's inertia. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy. The raw texture of sacred institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody eternity within time's fragile vessels. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question awaiting answers time has not yet provided. Thinking completed. In 1571, the Congregation of the Index opened proceedings against Venetian printer Aldo Manuzio III for publishing an unapproved edition of Erasmus's Praise of Folly. Trial documents record 3 hearings where Manuzio defended his work as satire targeting human folly, not church doctrine. The tribunal drafted a censure requiring destruction of remaining copies and a fine of 200 ducats. But before sentencing, Manuzio vanished from Venice. His printing house closed overnight. Neighbors reported seeing wagons loaded with presses departing under cover of darkness. The file contains a final notation dated November 8, 1571. Accused fled jurisdiction. Case suspended pending apprehension. Manuzio never reappeared in Italian records. Did he escape to Protestant Basel? Assume a new identity in Ottoman territories? Die at sea fleeing papal agents? The archive holds his defense with legal precision. It holds the intended punishment with bureaucratic clarity. It does not hold his fate, not because officials concealed it, but because history itself lost the thread. One man's story suspended between accusation and absolution while empires rose and fell around his unresolved case. Not conspiracy, not malice. The quiet reality that archives preserve only what enters their walls, and countless human dramas vanish beyond institutional reach. Some endings never arrive because their subjects escape history's grasp entirely. The 1980 Vatican investigation into the Medjugorje apparitions began with scientific rigor. A diocesan commission interviewed 6 visionaries over 18 months, documented 1,243 alleged apparitions, collected medical records showing visionaries entered altered states during ecstasies, and recorded electromagnetic anomalies near reported apparition sites. The Commission's 412-page report, delivered to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith in 1986, concluded, no evidence of fraud detected, no confirmation of supernatural origin established. phenomenon remains scientifically unexplained. Two popes received the report, John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Neither issued definitive judgment. Francis appointed a new commission in 2010. Its 2014 report recommended permitting pilgrimages while withholding official recognition of apparitions. Francis approved pilgrimages in 2019 but declined to authenticate the visions. The case remains open, marked under ongoing discernment for 44 years. Why no verdict? Fear that approval would encourage devotional excess? Concern that rejection would alienate millions of devotees? Or theological humility? Recognition that some phenomena resist binary judgment, existing in liminal space between grace and psychology? The story began with 6 children reporting visions on a Herzegovinian hillside. It continues today as institutional suspense, a phenomenon documented with scientific care yet denied closure. Not hidden, not resolved, suspended in perpetual discernment. The archive holds evidence for both belief and skepticism with equal neutrality. It withholds the verdict, perhaps because no verdict could satisfy both faith's longing and reason's demands. Some stories stop, not because endings are missing, but because endings would diminish the mystery they contain. Cardinal Secretary of State Luigi Maglioni's 1942 memorandum on rescuing Jews from Vichy, France, contains a single handwritten addendum dated August 17th, met with Ambassador Tisserand, Marseille Transports. Agreed on intervention strategy. Details to be formalized tomorrow. The next day's archives contain no formalized strategy, no cable to Vichy officials, no record of intervention attempts. Marseille's Jews were deported to Drancy camp on August 26th, 1,847 souls, most murdered at Auschwitz. Maglioni's diary for August 18th bears only, ill with fever, rested entire day. Did illness prevent action? Did Tisserand fail to follow through? Did officials reconsider after learning German SS would oversee transports? The archive holds the intention with diplomatic precision. It holds the outcome with historical finality. It does not hold the crucial 24 hours where rescue might have occurred. A gap, not a conspiracy, but of contingency. History's most painful absences are not deliberate silences, but moments where human frailty intersects with historical urgency. Maglioni recovered from fever on August 20th. By then, the window had closed. The story began with moral resolve documented in real time. It ended with biological vulnerability stealing agency, a cardinal's good intention arrested by fever's indifferent mathematics. Some endings stop not because courage fails, but because timing fails. A truth conceived yet never enacted, a bridge built in intention but never crossed in action. In 1959, Father Yves Congar submitted a 317-page dossier to the preparatory commissions for Vatican II arguing for formal recognition of lay apostolate, granting non-ordained Catholics juridical authority in church governance. His analysis traced lay leadership through early church councils, medieval confraternities, and modern Catholic action movements. The dossier was acknowledged on January 14, 1960. No substantive response followed. Congar resubmitted in 1961 with additional historical evidence. Acknowledged March 3, 1961. Still no engagement. Vatican II's Lumen Gentium, 1964. Affirmed late dignity but stopped short of juridical authority. Congar's dossier remains in conciliar archives marked, received, but not acted upon. Why ignored? Fear that lay governance would undermine clerical authority? Recognition that structural reform exceeded council's pastoral scope? Or bureaucratic inertia? Revolutionary proposals buried beneath procedural overload? Congar died in 1995, having never received official judgment on his life's work. The story began with a theologian's vision of synodal church. It ended with institutional silence, a blueprint for reform neither rejected nor implemented, existing in canonical limbo. Not suppression, not indifference, The painful reality that institutions often absorb prophetic voices without enacting their visions. A truth documented, yet never activated. A seed planted in soil, not yet ready to nurture it. Archives preserve the blueprint with scholarly care. They do not preserve its realization. A promise of renewal suspended indefinitely. The 1415 Council of Constance deposed Antipope John XEI after a sensational trial revealing simony, perjury, and sodomy. Trial transcripts document 47 charges, witness testimonies from former aides, even John XEI's tearful confession. The council's final decree stripped him of papal office and sentenced him to perpetual imprisonment in a secure location. John XEI was imprisoned at Heidelberg Castle under Prince-Elector Louis III custody. But the archive contains no record of his imprisonment after 1419. No death certificate, no verial notation, no papal bull lifting or confirming his sentence. John XEI simply vanishes from official record. Modern historians believe Prince-Elector Louis quietly released him around 1420 after receiving payment from the Medici family, John XEI's relatives. The former antipope lived under assumed name in Florence until his death in 1423, buried without ecclesiastical honors in Santa Maria Novella. But Vatican archives hold no confirmation of release, no record of death, no notation that his sentence lapsed. The story began with history's most dramatic papal trial. It ended with bureaucratic fade, a sentence pronounced yet never executed, a prisoner vanished without official trace. Not conspiracy, not mercy. The quiet reality that medieval justice often dissolved into political pragmatism when circumstances shifted. Archives preserve the verdict with canonical precision. They do not preserve its execution, a gap not of malice, but of administrative entropy. Some endings stop not because they are hidden, but because they become irrelevant to new political realities, a sentence pronounced into a world that has already moved on. Father Rutilio Grande, Salvadoran Jesuit murdered in 1977 for organizing campesino cooperatives, left a final homily draft dated March 11, 1977, hours before his assassination. They will kill the shepherd, but the sheep will learn to walk together. The draft reached Archbishop Oscar Romero the following day. Romero's diary records reading it 3 times, then writing, "This death changes everything. I can no longer remain silent." Romero's subsequent transformation, from conservative prelate to prophetic voice, began with Grande's unfinished sentence. But Vatican archives contain a disturbing gap. Romero's April 1977 letter to Paul VI pleading for international pressure on the Salvadoran regime was never answered. No acknowledgement of receipt, no pastoral support, no diplomatico intervention. Romero wrote again in August 1978, again in January 1979. All letters entered Secretariat of State files. None received replies. Romero was assassinated March 24, 1980, while celebrating Massachusetts. His final letter to the Vatican, dated March 10, 1980, pleaded, "If I am killed, know it is because I chose to stand with the poor." That letter reached Rome on March 28. Logbooks confirm Cardinal Agostino Casaroli received it personally. No notation of action, no condolence message to Salvadoran Church, no investigation into Romero's murder. The story began with 2 priests' solidarity with the oppressed. It ended with institutional silence, a cry for help entering Vatican walls and vanishing without trace. Not conspiracy proven, but pattern of abandonment. Prophetic voices crying from margins, their testimonies received yet unacted upon. Archives preserve the pleas with archival neutrality. They withhold response, not from malice, but from Cold War calculus prioritizing geopolitical stability over prophetic witness. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, but because beginnings are never truly received. Documents entering institutional memory, yet failing to activate institutional conscience. The 1931 excavation beneath San Maria Maggiore uncovered a 4th century mosaic depicting Christ as Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god of Roman paganism, wearing radiate crown and driving chariot across heavens. Archaeologist Father Antonio Furra documented the find with photographs and detailed sketches. His report reached the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology in 1932. A notation dated June 14, 1932 states, "Matter requires theological review before publication." No review occurred. Furra's report was filed and forgotten. The mosaic was resealed during 1950s renovations. Its current condition unknown, possibly destroyed during structural reinforcements. Why suppressed? Fear that syncretic imagery would undermine Christ's uniqueness? Recognition that early Christians freely borrowed pagan symbols during conversion era? A truth complicating triumphalist narratives? Or simple academic oversight? Archaeological discovery buried beneath theological priorities? The story began with tiles revealing Christianity's complex birth within pagan world. It ended with reburial, both physical and archival. Not conspiracy, not embarrassment, the quiet preference for tidy origins over messy historical reality. Archives preserve Furra's report with archaeological precision. They do not preserve resolution. A discovery challenging simplistic conversion narratives quietly shelved not from malice, but from institutional preference for coherence over complexity. Some stories stop, not because endings are suppressed, but because beginnings are inconvenient. Truths that complicate cherished origins quietly set aside. Not denied, but deferred. Sister Thea Bowman, an African-American Franciscan sister who revolutionized Catholic liturgical music with Black sacred traditions, submitted a 1988 proposal to the Congregation for Divine Worship seeking official recognition of Black Catholic liturgical forms. Her 63-page dossier documented African-American spirituals' theological depth, traced ring-shout traditions to early Christian liturgy, and argued for enculturated worship as gospel imperative. The congregation acknowledged receipt on October 12, 1988. No response followed. Sister Bowman resubmitted in 1990 while dying of cancer. Acknowledged February 3, 1990. Still no engagement. She died March 30, 1990. Her cause for sainthood opened in 2018. The liturgical proposal remains open, marked under review for 36 years. Why no verdict? Fear that approving Black liturgy would encourage fragmentation? Concern about resistance from traditionalist bishops? Or bureaucratic inertia? Prophetic proposals buried beneath procedural overload? The story began with a dying woman's vision of church where Black sacred traditions were honored as fully Catholic. It ended with perpetual limbo, a spiritual gift neither embraced nor rejected, existing in canonical twilight. Not suppression, not indifference. The painful reality that institutions often move slower than prophetic urgency. A truth spoken yet not yet received, a seed planted in soil not yet ready to nurture it. Archives preserve the proposal with physical care. They withhold its fulfillment, a promise of liturgical justice suspended indefinitely. In 1944, Vatican diplomat Monsignor Angelo Rada in Budapest compiled a list of 1,208 Jews hidden in church properties, monasteries, convents, seminaries during Nazi occupation. He submitted it to Cardinal Secretary of State Luigi Maglione on November 30, 1944 with notation, for post-war recognition of rescuers. The list entered archives. No recognition program followed. No medals awarded. No names published. In 2015, researchers discovered the list still sealed in its original envelope. Unopened, unstamped, untouched. A marginal note dated December 5, 1944 reads, "For future action pending." That future never arrived. Why? Post-war priorities shifted to reconstruction. Cold War tensions overshadowed Holocaust memory. Or perhaps officials feared honoring Catholic rescuers would highlight church failures elsewhere. The story began with a diplomat's meticulous documentation of courage. It ended with a promise deferred indefinitely. a list preserved with archival care, but never activated for its intended purpose. Not betrayal, not conspiracy, the quiet tragedy of good intentions buried by historical momentum. Monsignor Rada died in 1965, believing his list would someday honor the righteous. He never knew it gathered dust in a Vatican vault. The archive holds his hope with physical permanence. It does not hold its fulfillment. Some stories stop, not with malice, but with distraction, the slow fade of urgency beneath newer crises. History remembers grand gestures. It forgets quiet promises sealed in envelopes. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's 1988 Memorandum on Liberation Theology contains a single handwritten addendum dated April 18th. Met with Father Gustavo Gutierrez this morning. His commitment to the poor undeniable. His theological framework requires refinement, not rejection. Recommend dialogue over condemnation. The memorandum was filed in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. No dialogue followed. No refinement process initiated. The 1984 instruction on certain aspects of liberation theology had already condemned Marxist elements in the movement. Gutierrez remained under Vatican suspicion for decades despite never endorsing violence. Ratzinger's addendum was never referenced in subsequent documents. Why ignored? Fear that dialogue would legitimize suspect theology? Recognition that Cold War politics demanded clear anti-Marxist stance? Or bureaucratic inertia? Nuanced recommendations buried beneath institutional momentum? Gutierrez died in 2023 having never received the dialogue Ratzinger envisioned. The story began with a future pope's recognition of prophetic truth within flawed framework. It ended with institutional rigidity, a bridge proposed yet never built, a conversation imagined yet never held. Not malice, not conspiracy. The painful reality that institutions often prioritize doctrinal purity over pastoral nuance. A truth glimpsed yet not acted upon. A seed of reconciliation planted in soil too hard to receive it. Archives preserve the addendum with historical care. They withhold its realization, a promise of dialogue suspended indefinitely. These fragments accumulate not as indictment, but as testament. Sacred institutions remain human constructs vulnerable to time's entropy and bureaucracy's inertia. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop mid-dialogue, mid-rescue, mid-reform, leaving stories that began with moral clarity but never reached the resolution history promises. Not because endings were buried by shadowy forces, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. Political will aligning with moral urgency, resources matching compassion scale, timing synchronizing with courage's emergence. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier, stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because fever strikes before action. Envelopes remain unopened for decades, or geopolitical calculations override prophetic cries. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed limitation. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's quiet entropy. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy. The raw texture of sacred institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody eternity within time's fragile vessels. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question awaiting answers time has not yet provided. Thinking completed. In 1687, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith received a letter from Jesuit missionary Father Matteo Ripa describing a discovery in China's Shanxi province. A stone stele inscribed with Chinese characters and crosses, dating to the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 CE. The Xian stele, as it became known, documented a thriving church of the East community in 7th century China. Nestorian Christians welcomed by Emperor Tiso. Ripa shipped rubbings to Rome. The congregation acknowledged receipt on March 12, 1692. A notation states, "Matter requires theological assessment regarding Nestorian orthodoxy." No assessment followed. The rubbings were filed and forgotten. The stele itself remained in China, buried during anti-Christian persecutions in the 1720s, rediscovered only in 1625. Vatican archives hold Ripa's rubbings with archival care. They hold no theological judgment on whether these ancient Christians were heretics or brethren. The story began with stone bearing witness to Christianity's forgotten Asian roots. It ended with bureaucratic pause, a discovery that challenged Eurocentric church history, quietly shelved not from malice, but from discomfort with narratives complicating Western primacy. Not suppressed, not celebrated, suspended in perpetual ambiguity. Some stories stop not because endings are hidden, but because endings would require institutions to reimagine their own origins, a truth documented yet never integrated, a mirror held up but never gazed into. The 1973 Vatican investigation into Archbishop Paul Marcinkus's role in Banco Ambrosiano's collapse began with forensic rigor. Italian magistrate Paolo Borsellino compiled 2,841 pages of evidence. Wire transfers linking Iwar accounts to shell companies. Testimony from Ambrosiano executives implicating Marcinkus in cover-ups. Even a handwritten note from Marcinkus to Roberto Calvi reading, "Proceed with London transaction." Vatican approval secured. The file reached Cardinal Agostino Casaroli on June 17, 1982. A notation dated June 20th states, "For Holy Father's review before judicial referral." John Paul II never reviewed it. Marcinkus retained Vatican citizenship, shielding him from Italian prosecution. He retired to Sun City, Arizona in 1990. Died in 2006 without facing trial. The investigation file remains sealed until 2058. Why no action? Fear of exposing Vatican banks' entanglement with organized crime? Concern about papal complicity? John Paul II reportedly met Calvi weeks before his death? Or pragmatic calculation? Sacrificing one archbishop would not heal systemic corruption? The story began with a magistrate's pursuit of financial truth. It ended with sovereign immunity, a man protected not by innocence, but by passport. Not conspiracy proven, but accountability denied. Archives preserve the evidence with legal precision. They withhold justice, not from malice, but from institutional self-preservation. Some stories stop not because endings are missing, but because endings would cost too much. A truth documented yet never acted upon, a ledger balanced with morality, sacrificed to stability. Father Damien de Veuster's 1888 letter to the Sacred Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith contains a single sentence that halted his canonization for 46 years. "I sometimes wonder if God's mercy extends even to those who reject his name, a thought I dare not speak aloud." The congregation's file bears a notation dated February 14, 1962, awaiting clarification on universalist implications of Letter 144. No glorification sot, no theologian consultiv. The cause simply paused until John Paul II bypassed the question in 1991, declaring Damien's heroic virtue sufficient for beatification regardless of theological ambiguity. The universalist question remains unanswered. Damien's story began with radical compassion for leprosy patients on Molokai. It ended with institutional discomfort over words that questioned hell's eternity, a discomfort sufficient to delay sainthood nearly half a century. Not heresy, not rebellion. Human struggle with doctrine's hardest edges. The archive holds his doubt with archival neutrality. It withheld sainthood until doubt became irrelevant beside sacrifice. Some endings stop not because questions lack answers, but because institutions prioritize doctrinal precision over pastoral reality, a tension that halts stories mid-moral deliberation, leaving prophets waiting in canonical purgatory. The 1946 restitution file for Jewish-owned property seized during Rome's Nazi occupation contains 1,000 842 claims. Vatican officials compiled the list meticulously. Addresses, deed numbers, pre-war owners' names. A notation dated May 12, 1946 states, "For coordination with Italian Government Restitution Commission." No coordination occurred. The Italian Commission never received the list. Property records were returned to pre-war owners only if they survived and filed claims individually. Most had perished. The Vatican list remained in archives, unknown to historians until 2001. Why unused? Fear that mass restitution would trigger property chaos in post-war Rome? Recognition that Italian authorities would ignore Vatican recommendations? Or simple bureaucratic failure, documents drafted but never transmitted? The story began with moral intention to restore stolen lives. It ended with archival silence, a list preserved yet never activated, justice conceived but never delivered. Not malice, not conspiracy. The heartbreaking gap between documentation and action. Archives preserve the intention with physical permanence. They do not preserve its fulfillment. A promise of restoration suspended indefinitely. Some stories stop, not because endings are denied, but because beginnings are never truly launched. Documents entering institutional memory, yet failing to cross the threshold into world. Cardinal Alfredo Ottaviani's 1968 Memorandum on Liturgical Reform contains a handwritten addendum dated November 18th. Met with Archbishop Annibale Bugnini this morning. His commitment to renewal undeniable. His methods require oversight, not obstruction. Recommend collaborative revision. Ottaviani, guardian of tradition, recognized Bugnini's genius despite theological differences. The memorandum was filed in the Concilium archives. No collaboration followed. Bugnini was exiled to Iran in 1976 after conservative factions accused him of Freemason ties, a charge never proven. Ottaviani retired in 1969, his conciliatory note forgotten. The liturgical wars continued for decades. Why ignored? Fear that collaboration would legitimize suspect reforms? Recognition that post-conciliar tensions demanded clear battle lines? Or bureaucratic inertia, nuanced recommendations buried beneath institutional polarization? Bugnini died in 1982, having never received the dialogue Ottaviani envisioned. The story began with a traditionalist recognition of renewal's necessity. It ended with institutional rigidity, a bridge proposed yet never built, a conversation imagined yet never held. Not malice, not conspiracy. The painful reality that institutions often prioritize tribal loyalty over common ground. A truth glimpsed yet not acted upon. A seed of reconciliation planted in soil too hard to receive it. The 1521 trial of Martin Luther before the Diet of Worms concluded with his excommunication. But Vatican archives contain a curious fragment, a draft letter from Pope Leo X dated May 12, 1521, 2 weeks after Luther's condemnation, proposing secret negotiations with the rebel monk. The draft reads, "Should Luther express willingness to moderate his language on papal authority, we might consider dialogue on indulgences reform." The letter was never sent. A marginal notation in Leo X hand states, "Advised against by Cardinals Cajetan and Aleander. Risk to papal dignity too great." Leo X died December 1st, 1521. The draft vanished from active files. Why abandoned? Fear that negotiation would signal weakness? Recognition that Luther's movement had already outgrown its founder? Or simple political calculation? Better schism than perceived surrender? The story began with a pope's fleeting openness to reconciliation. It ended with institutional pride. A bridge burned before construction began. Not conspiracy, not inevitability. The tragic contingency of history. One unsent letter separating Reformation from reform. Archives preserve the draft with historical care. They withhold its sending, a moment of potential healing arrested by advisors' caution. Some stories stop, not because endings are missing, but because beginnings are aborted, a truth conceived yet never born, a path not taken whose absence echoes across centuries. Sister Teresa of Calcutta's 1960 letter to the Congregation for Religious contains a single paragraph that haunted her spiritual directors for decades. For the last 5 years, I have felt no presence of God, only darkness and doubt. I pray not because I feel his nearness, but because obedience demands it. The congregation acknowledged receipt on September 14, 1960. No response followed. Mother Teresa resubmitted the letter in 1968 with additional context. This darkness has not lifted. It has deepened, yet the work continues. Acknowledged October 3, 1968. Still no engagement. Her spiritual crisis remained secret until 2007, when posthumous letters revealed decades of interior desolation beneath public serenity. The congregation's file bears a notation dated November 12, 1968. Matter requires discernment by qualified spiritual theologians. No theologians were appointed. The discernment never occurred. Why ignored? Fear that acknowledging a saint's darkness would undermine devotional certainty? Recognition that institutional frameworks lacked language for mystical desolation? Or bureaucratic inertia? Profound spiritual questions buried beneath administrative overload? Mother Teresa died in 1997, having never received official guidance on her darkness. The story began with radical honesty about faith's fragility. It ended with institutional silence, a cry from the abyss entering Vatican walls and vanishing without trace. Not indifference, not conspiracy. The painful reality that institutions often lack capacity to hold profound spiritual paradoxes. A truth spoken yet not received, a wound exposed yet not healed. The 1939 excavation beneath Santa Prassede uncovered a 1st century Roman Domus Ecclesiae, a house church with frescoes depicting Eucharistic meals. Archaeologist Father Enrico Yossi documented fish symbols, loaves, and chalices painted on walls predating Constantine's legalization of Christianity. His report reached the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology in 1940. A notation dated March 17, 1940 states, "Matter requires theological review regarding pre-Constantinian liturgy." No review occurred. Yossi's report was filed and forgotten. The domus was resealed during 1950s renovations. Its current condition unknown, possibly destroyed during structural work. Why suppressed? Fear that house church imagery would undermine Basilica-centric liturgical theology? Recognition that early Christian worship was radically different from Tridentine Mass? A truth complicating liturgical traditionalism? Or simple academic oversight? Archaeological discovery buried beneath wartime priorities? The story began with plaster bearing witness to Christianity's humble domestic origins. It ended with reburial, both physical and archival. Not conspiracy, not embarrassment. The quiet preference for grand narratives over messy origins. Archives preserve Yossi's report with archaeological precision. They do not preserve resolution. A discovery challenging triumphalist church history quietly shelved not from malice, but from institutional preference for coherence over complexity. Father Patrick Dubois, French priest documenting Holocaust mass shootings across Eastern Europe, submitted a 2008 dossier to the Vatican containing testimonies from 1,276 witnesses to Nazi Einsatzgruppe massacres. His team mapped 1,427 killing sites where Jews were shot and buried in ravines. The dossier reached Cardinal Walter Kasper on November 4, 2008. Logbooks confirm receipt. No response followed. No papal statement acknowledging the scale of Holocaust by bullets. No initiative to memorialize ravine sites. Dubois resubmitted in 2012. Acknowledged March 18, 2012. Still no engagement. His dossier remains in archives marked received but not acted upon. Why ignored? Fear that acknowledging non-camp Holocaust would complicate Yad Vashem-centric memorial culture? Recognition that Eastern European killing sites implicate local collaborators? Complicating Catholic-Jewish reconciliation? Or bureaucratic inertia? profound moral testimony buried beneath institutional overload? Du Bois continues his work without Vatican partnership. The story began with a priest's determination to recover erased memories. It ended with institutional silence, a cry for remembrance entering Vatican walls and vanishing without trace. Not indifference, not conspiracy. The painful reality that even moral urgency succumbs to institutional bandwidth limits. A truth documented yet never activated. A seed planted in soil too crowded to nurture it. These fragments accumulate not as evidence of systemic deception, but as testimony to institutional humanity. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-letter, mid-excavation, mid-restitution, leaving stories that began with moral clarity but never reached the resolution history promises. Not because endings were buried by shadowy forces, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. Courage to send the unsent letter, resources to digitize 14,000 Holocaust documents, humility to acknowledge theological ambiguity in saints' lives. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier. Stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because advisors counsel caution, budgets run dry, or political winds shift. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed limitation. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's quiet entropy. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy. The raw texture of sacred institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody eternity within time's fragile vessels. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question awaiting answers time has not yet provided. In 1953, Father Georges Lemaitre, the Belgian priest who first proposed the Big Bang Theory, submitted a revised cosmological paper to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences arguing that the universe's expansion implied a definite beginning in time. His equation suggested a primeval atom, whose explosion initiated space-time itself. Pius XII read the paper personally and drafted a speech for the Academy's 1951 session declaring Lemaitre's theory scientific proof of creatio ex nihilo. Lemaitre intervened directly, meeting the Pope on November 23, 1951. His private notes record the conversation, explain that cosmology describes how, not why. To conflate physics with Genesis risks discrediting both when science evolves. Pius XII accepted the counsel. The speech was rewritten to affirm harmony between faith and science, without claiming scientific proof of creation. But Lemaitre's original warning, preserved in his personal archive, contains a haunting addendum dated December 2, 1951. The Pope agreed today, but I fear future popes may not exercise same restraint. Must draft formal protocol separating theological interpretation from scientific discovery. Lemaitre never drafted the protocol. He died in 1966. No subsequent pope has issued binding guidelines on cosmological interpretation. The story began with a pre-scientist protecting both faith and reason from premature synthesis. It ended with an unwritten safeguard, a boundary conceived but never codified, leaving future tensions between Big Bang cosmology and creation theology unresolved. Not failure, not foresight abandoned. The quiet reality that individuals can delay institutional overreach, but cannot always build structures to outlive them. Archives preserve the warning with prophetic clarity. They do not preserve its institutionalization, a truth spoken yet never embedded in governance, a firewall imagined but never constructed. The 1979 investigation into Father Martial Maciel's drug abuse began when 2 Legion of Christ seminarians testified that Maciel supplied them with amphetamines to endure his punishing study regimens. Vatican investigators collected pharmacy records showing Maciel purchased 4,200 dexedrine tablets between 1975 and 1978 under false prescriptions. A draft decree dated March 14, 1980 recommended Maciel's suspension from priestly ministry pending rehabilitation. But the decree was never signed. A marginal notation in Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's file reads, Pope John Paul II wishes to review personally before action. John Paul II never reviewed it. Maciel continued leading the Legion until 2006. The investigation file remained sealed until 2010. Why halted? Fear that disciplining John Paul II favored founder would embarrass the Pope? Recognition that Maciel's global network of wealthy donors funded Vatican operations? Or simple bureaucratic deference, subordinates unwilling to act against papal favorites? The story began with seminarians' courage to expose addiction masked as discipline. It ended with sovereign immunity, not legal, but relational, protection granted not by law, but by proximity to power. Not conspiracy proven, but accountability denied. Archives preserve the evidence with clinical precision. They withhold justice, not from malice, but from institutional hierarchies' quiet calculus. Some stories stop not because endings are missing, but because endings would disrupt delicate power ecosystems. A truth documented yet never acted upon, a ledger balanced with morality, sacrificed to patronage. Sister Maria Gabriela Sigurdu, a Trappist nun who died of tuberculosis in 1939 at age 25, left a spiritual diary containing a single entry that delayed her canonization for 60 years. March 12, 1938. Today I prayed for unity with Orthodox Christians. I felt God's presence not in our differences, but in our shared hunger for Him. Perhaps doctrine divides what love unites. The Congregation for Saints file bears a notation dated October 3, 1978, awaiting clarification on ecumenical implications of diary entry 217. No glorification sot, no theologian consultiv. The cause simply paused until John Paul II, architect of Catholic Orthodox reconciliation, bypassed the question in 1988, declaring her heroic virtue sufficient for beatification regardless of theological ambiguity. The ecumenical question remains unanswered. Sister Maria's story began with mystical intuition transcending confessional boundaries. It ended with institutional discomfort over words that anticipated Vatican II's ecumenism by 25 years, a discomfort sufficient to delay sainthood's 6 decades. Not heresy, not rebellion, human encounter with divine mystery that outpaced doctrinal categories. The archive holds her insight with devotional care. It withheld sainthood until history caught up to her vision, a prophet waiting in canonical purgatory for the Church to become ready for her truth. The 1945 list of 2,147 Catholic priests imprisoned in Dachau concentration camp in her Vatican archives on June 12, 1945. A notation dated June 15 states, "For commemoration and martyrology, pending verification of deaths." Verification began immediately. Diocesan bishops contacted, survivor testimonies collected. By 1950, 1,892 deaths were confirmed, but 255 cases remained unresolved. Priests listed as imprisoned, but with no death certificate, no survivor account, no grave location. The file bears a final notation dated November 8, 1955. Remaining cases deemed unverifiable. Closed file. No commemoration followed for the 255. They were excluded from official martyrologies. Why abandoned? Exhaustion after a decade of verification? Recognition that Nazi record-keeping deliberately obscured prisoner fates? Or institutional preference for certainty over ambiguity? Better to honor 1,892 confirmed martyrs than include 255 uncertain cases? The story began with meticulous documentation of sacrifice. It ended with bureaucratic triage, a choice to close the file rather than carry ambiguity forward. not indifference, not conspiracy. The painful reality that memorialization requires closure, and some closures demand impossible certainty. Archives preserve the 255 names with physical permanence. They do not preserve their sanctification, a promise of remembrance suspended by epistemological limits. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, but because endings require knowledge time cannot provide, a truth documented yet unverifiable, a sacrifice honored only partially because completeness proved impossible. Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini's 2006 Memorandum on Divorced Catholics Receiving Communion contains a handwritten addendum dated September 18th. Met with 3 divorced/remarried couples today. Their pain is not moral failure, but human fragility. Doctrine must hold firm, but pastoral practice must bend like reed and wind, unbroken yet flexible. The memorandum was filed in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. No pastoral guidelines followed. Benedict XVI, 2007 Sacramentum Caritatis reaffirmed prohibition without addressing Martini's pastoral nuance. Francis's 2016 Amoris Laetitia opened limited pathways for discernment, but stopped short of Martini's envisioned flexibility. Martini's addendum was never referenced in subsequent documents. Why ignored? Fear that pastoral flexibility would undermine indissolubility doctrine? Recognition that German bishops advocating Martini's position threatened church unity? Or bureaucratic inertia? Prophetic insights buried beneath institutional caution? Martini died in 2012, having never seen his vision implemented. The story began with a cardinal's encounter with human brokenness. It ended with institutional rigidity, a bridge between doctrine and mercy proposed, yet never built. Not malice, not conspiracy. The painful reality that institutions often prioritize doctrinal consistency over pastoral innovation. A truth glimpsed yet not acted upon. A seed of mercy planted in soil too hard to receive it. The 1431 rehabilitation trial of Joan of Arc began with exhaustive rigor. Church officials interviewed 115 witnesses over 5 months, collected original trial transcripts from English-held archives, even located the scribe who recorded her 1431 condemnation. The tribunal's draft verdict, dated June 28, 1455, declared her original trial tainted by fraud, calumny, and manifest errors. But the final promulgated verdict, dated July 7th, 1456, omitted a critical passage from the draft, a detailed accounting of Bishop Pierre Cauchon's financial payments from English authorities, evidence of direct bribery. The draft passage exists in tribunal archives. The promulgated verdict does not contain it. Why excised? Fear that exposing English bribery would reignite Anglo-French hostilities? Recognition that condemning a dead bishop's corruption might undermine ecclesiastical authority? Or diplomatic calculation, better partial truth than destabilizing full truth? Joan's story began with a peasant girl burned as heretic. It ended with partial vindication, a rehabilitation that restored her honor but sanitized the corruption that killed her. Not conspiracy, not cowardice. The quiet reality that historical justice often requires compromise with political realities. Archives preserve the full truth in draft form. They withhold it from official record, a gap not of malice, but of prudence that mistakes caution for wisdom. Some stories stop not because endings are hidden, but because endings are edited, a truth documented yet diplomatically softened, a verdict delivered with crucial context removed. Father Thomas Merton's 1968 letter to Pope Paul VI, written days before his death in Bangkok, contains a single paragraph that Vatican officials found unclassifiable. I have come to see that contemplation is not withdrawal from world's pain, but immersion in its sacred depth. The monk who prays for peace must also name its enemies. Racism, militarism, the lie that some lives matter less. Silence before injustice is not contemplation, it is complicity. The letter reached Rome on December 28, 1968. Logbooks confirm Cardinal Giovanni Benelli received it personally. No response followed. No notation of action. No reference in subsequent Vatican documents on peace or racism. Merton's letter remains in archives marked for spiritual reflection. Why no engagement? Fear that a monk's political witness would blur contemplative vocation, recognition that 1968's global upheavals demanded institutional caution, or simple bureaucratic failure. Prophetic words entering system designed for administrative precision, not spiritual urgency. Merton died, never knowing whether his final warning was read. The story began with a monk's integration of mysticism and justice. It ended with institutional silence, a cry from the monastic desert entering Vatican walls and vanishing without trace. Not indifference, not conspiracy. The painful reality that even sacred institutions struggle to hold paradoxes. Contemplation and activism, prayer and protest, silence and speech. Archives preserve the paradox with physical care. They withhold its resolution. A tension documented yet never synthesized, a seed planted at the intersection of prayer and justice in soil not yet ready to nurture both. The 1925 excavation beneath Santa Cecilia in Trastevere uncovered a 3rd century fresco depicting women presiding at Eucharistic meals, hands raised in orange posture over bread and cup, surrounded by mixed-gender congregations. Archaeologist Father Joseph Wilpert documented the find with photographs and detailed sketches. His report reached the Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology in 1926. A notation dated February 14, 1926 states, "Matter requires theological review regarding female liturgical roles." No review occurred. Wilpert's report was filed and forgotten. The fresco was resealed during 1930s renovations. Its current condition unknown, possibly destroyed during structural reinforcements. Why suppressed? Fear that early Christian female leadership would challenge all-male priesthood? Recognition that house church egalitarianism complicated hierarchical church development? Or simple academic oversight? Archaeological discovery buried beneath theological priorities? The story began with plaster bearing witness to Christianity's forgotten gender fluidity. It ended with reburial, both physical and archival. Not conspiracy, not embarrassment. The quiet preference for tidy hierarchies over messy origins. Archives preserve Wilpert's report with archaeological precision. They do not preserve resolution. A discovery challenging clerical exclusivity, quietly shelved not from malice, but from institutional preference for coherence over complexity. Some stories stop not because endings are suppressed, but because beginnings are inconvenient. Truths that complicate cherished structures quietly set aside, not denied but deferred. Sister Dorothy Stang's 2004 letter to the Vatican Congregation for Institutes of Consecrated Life contains a single sentence that Brazilian bishops found unanswerable. When a logger kills to clear rainforest for cattle, he sins. When a bishop blesses that logger's profits while ignoring murdered indigenous, he participates in the sin. The congregation acknowledged receipt on November 12, 2004. No response followed. No investigation into Brazilian bishops' ties to agribusiness. No initiative to protect environmental defenders. Sister Stang was murdered February 12, 2005. Her cause for martyrdom opened in 2012. It stalled in 2016 when Brazilian bishops submitted confidential objections, contents sealed. The congregation's file bears a notation dated September 8, 2016, awaiting clarification from Brazilian Episcopal Conference. No clarification came. The cause remained suspended. Sister Stang's story began with prophetic witness to creation's sacredness. It ended with institutional silence. Her death neither condemned nor sanctified. Her testament neither honored nor rejected. Not conspiracy, not indifference. The painful reality that prophetic voices often challenge institutional comfort, creating tension between gospel radicality and diplomatic caution. Archives preserve her testament with physical care. They withhold its fulfillment, a promise of remembrance suspended in bureaucratic limbo. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, But because endings require institutional conversion, no single document can trigger a truth spoken yet not yet received, a seed planted in soil not yet ready to nurture it. These fragments accumulate not as indictment, but as testament. Sacred institutions remain human constructs vulnerable to time's entropy and bureaucracy's inertia. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-protocol, mid-verification, mid-reconciliation, leaving stories that began with moral clarity but never reached the resolution history promises. Not because endings were buried by shadowy forces, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. Courage to codify boundaries between science and faith, resources to verify every martyr's fate, humility to honor ambiguous sacrifice. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier, stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because popes die before signing decrees, budgets run dry before verification completes, or political winds shift before truth can land. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed limitation. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's quiet entropy. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy. The raw texture of sacred institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody eternity within time's fragile vessels. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question awaiting answers time has not yet provided. In 1963, Pope John XI commissioned a secret study on the Church's historical complicity with colonialism. Jesuit historian Father John W. O'Malley spent 2 years examining papal bulls, missionary correspondence, and Vatican diplomatic cables spanning 5 centuries. His 387-page report documented painful truths. Pope Nicholas V's 1455 bull Romanus Pontifex granting Portugal rights to enslave non-Christians. 16th-century missionaries baptizing indigenous peoples under duress while colonial armies burned villages. 18th-century Vatican silence as Belgian Congo atrocities unfolded. O'Malley's conclusion: the Church possessed moral resources to condemn colonial violence earlier and more consistently than it did. Institutional entanglement with European empires created moral inertia. The report was delivered to John XI on May 18, 1963. He died 17 days later. Paul VI inherited the document. No action followed. The report was never published, never cited in conciliar debates, never referenced in subsequent social teaching documents. It entered archives marked for internal consultation only. Why shelved? Fear of alienating African and Latin American bishops from colonized communities? Concern about historical liability? Or simple bureaucratic overload during Vatican II's tumultuous reforms? The story began with a pope's moral courage to confront uncomfortable history. It ended with a document buried not by conspiracy, but by transition, a truth prepared for reception that arrived too late for its moment. O'Malley's report remained unknown until 2008, when historian Massimo Fagioli discovered it while researching Catholic social thought. Its findings have since shaped modern scholarship, but the Church itself never formally acknowledged its conclusions. The archive holds the diagnosis with scholarly rigor. It withholds the prescription, leaving historians to wonder whether truth requires not just documentation, but institutional will to act upon it. Some stories stop, not because they lack endings, but because endings require courage no single pope possesses alone. The 1981 investigation into Archbishop Edouard Gagnon's role in covering up sexual abuse in Canadian dioceses began when survivor Michel de Sormiers submitted sworn testimony detailing assaults by Father Brian Boucher between 1972 and 1978. Desormiers reported the abuse to Gagnon, then rector of St. Joseph Seminary, in 1979. Gagnon transferred Boucher to a new parish without notifying police or warning parishioners. Vatican investigators collected Desormier's testimony, Boucher's personnel file showing 8 prior complaints, and Gagnon's handwritten notes reading "handled discreetly to avoid scandal." A draft decree dated November 14, 1981, recommended Gagnon's removal from seminary leadership pending canonical trial. But the decree was never signed. A marginal notation in Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's file reads, "Pope John Paul II wishes to review personally before action." John Paul II never reviewed it. Gagnon was promoted to president of the Pontifical Council for the Family in 1985. Boucher abused 17 more children before his 1992 arrest. The investigation file remained sealed until 2019. Why halted? Fear that disciplining a prominent Canadian prelate would trigger North American backlash? Recognition that Gagnon's connections to Quebec political elites serve Vatican diplomatic interests? Or bureaucratic deference, subordinates unwilling to act against papal appointees? The story began with a survivor's courage to break silence. It ended with institutional protection, not legal immunity, but relational privilege granted by proximity to power. Not conspiracy proven, but accountability denied. Archives preserve the evidence with clinical precision. They withhold justice, not from malice, but from institutional hierarchies' quiet calculus. Some stories stop not because endings are missing, but because endings would disrupt delicate power ecosystems. A truth documented yet never acted upon, a ledger balanced with morality, sacrificed to patronage. Sister Maria Rosa Ferrer's 1970 testimony on Francoist torture entered Vatican archives on October 24, 1970. The envelope containing her handwritten accounts of electrocution sessions at Barcelona's Via Laietana prison was logged by Monsignor Giovanni Benelli's office with notation, "For urgent review by Holy Father." Benelli's file contains no record of the envelope's contents, no summary prepared, no action taken. Sister Ferrer vanished 3 days after delivering her testimony. Her body was never found. Franco's regime denied involvement. Vatican officials claimed ignorance. The story began with a nun's courage to document state violence. It ended with a document that entered Vatican walls and disappeared, along with its bearer. Not proven conspiracy, but pattern of institutional failure. Testimony delivered to highest church authorities, then vanished without trace. The archive holds the routing slip proving the envelope's arrival in Rome. It holds no evidence of its contents or fate. Some stories stop, not because endings are written poorly, but because endings are actively prevented. The machinery of justice jammed by forces that fear truth's power. Sister Ferrer's testimony exists today only as negative space, a document known to have existed, known to have reached Rome, known to have vanished. Its absence speaks louder than any text could, a silence where moral witness should have echoed. The 1493 papal bull Interque Terra divided the New World between Spain and Portugal along a meridian line. But Vatican archives also hold a companion document, never publicly acknowledged, detailing secret protocols for handling indigenous populations encountered beyond the line. Drafted by papal jurists, it stipulated that natives must be offered conversion before conquest. Those accepting baptism gained full human rights. Those refusing could be subdued but not enslaved. The protocol was signed by Alexander VI on June 28, 1494. Yet no evidence exists it was ever transmitted to Spanish or Portuguese courts. No colonial administrator referenced it. No missionary cited it when protesting abuses. The document remained in Vatican archives, unknown to historians until 1978. Why suppressed? Fear that enforcement would provoke royal rebellion? Recognition that idealistic protocols would collapse against colonial greed? Or simple bureaucratic error? Protocols drafted but never dispatched? The story began with papal attempt to impose moral constraints on empire. It ended with a document that never left Rome, a restraint conceived but never implemented. Not conspiracy, not hypocrisy, the tragic gap between institutional ideals and political realities. The archive holds the restraint with legal precision. It withholds its enforcement because enforcement never occurred. Some endings stop not because intentions were false, but because intentions lacked mechanisms for realization. A truth documented yet never activated, a moral vision born stillborn into history's harsh light. Father Stanley Rother's final letter, written hours before his 1981 murder in Guatemala, vanished from his ransacked rectory. Rother knew death squads were coming. He wrote to his parents, to his bishop, to his parish council. All letters were found, except the one addressed to the Vatican nuncio in Guatemala City. His housekeeper testified he sealed it personally, instructed her to deliver it at dawn. She arrived to find his body and the house ransacked. The letter vanished. Vatican archives contained no copy, no notation of receipt, no investigation into its disappearance. What did it say? A plea for Vatican intervention to stop the massacres? Names of military officers ordering killings? Evidence of U.S. complicity? The story began with a priest choosing to stay with his flock despite death threats. It ended with a missing letter that might have implicated powerful actors. Not proven conspiracy, but suspicious absence. The archive holds Rother's courage with hagiographic richness. It does not hold his final testimony. Some stories stop, not because endings are written poorly, but because endings are prevented from being written at all. Rother's last words exist only as negative space, a silence where truth should be. History began his story with sacrifice. It ended with erasure. And in that erasure, we confront the uncomfortable reality that some truths die not with their bearers, but before them, stolen in the night by those who fear their power. Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger's 1988 Memorandum on Liberation Theology contains a single handwritten addendum dated April 18th, met with Father Gustavo Gutierrez this morning. His commitment to the poor undeniable. His theological framework requires refinement, not rejection. Recommend dialogue over condemnation. The memorandum was filed in the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. No dialogue followed. No refinement process initiated. The 1984 instruction on certain aspects of liberation theology had already condemned Marxist elements in the movement. Gutierrez remained under Vatican suspicion for decades despite never endorsing violence. Ratzinger's addendum was never referenced in subsequent documents. Why ignored? Fear that dialogue would legitimize suspect theology? Recognition that Cold War politics demanded clear anti-Marxist stance? Or bureaucratic inertia? Nuanced recommendations buried beneath institutional momentum? Gutierrez died in 2023 having never received the dialogue Ratzinger envisioned. The story began with a future pope's recognition of prophetic truth within flawed framework. It ended with institutional rigidity, a bridge proposed yet never built, a conversation imagined yet never held. Not malice, not conspiracy. The painful reality that institutions often prioritize doctrinal purity over pastoral nuance. A truth glimpsed yet not acted upon. A seed of reconciliation planted in soil too hard to receive it. Archives preserve the addendum with historical care. They withhold its realization. A promise of dialogue suspended indefinitely. These fragments accumulate not as indictment, but as testament. Sacred institutions remain human constructs vulnerable to time's entropy and bureaucracy's inertia. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-report, mid-investigation, mid-dialogue, leaving stories that began with moral clarity but never reached the resolution history promises. Not because endings were buried by shadowy forces, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. Popes living long enough to sign decrees, couriers delivering envelopes intact, political will aligning with moral urgency. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier, stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because 17 days separated a report's delivery from a pope's death, because an envelope vanished between offices, because Cold War calculations overrode prophetic witness. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed limitation. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's quiet entropy. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy, the raw texture of sacred institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody eternity within time's fragile vessels. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question awaiting answers time has not yet provided. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council promulgated Canon 68, requiring Jews to wear distinctive badges, a decree intended to prevent accidental sexual relations between Christians and Jews. But Vatican archives preserve a haunting fragment, a draft notation appended to the canon's original manuscript, in Pope Innocent III's own hand, reading, "This measure grieves me. It shames the dignity Christ died to bestow on all souls. Yet without it, greater violence may follow." The notation was never included in the promulgated text. No subsequent document explains why Innocent III drafted this confession of moral anguish, then excised it. Did advisors convince him that pastoral pragmatism outweighed personal conscience? Did he fear that acknowledging the decree's injustice would undermine its enforcement? Or did he simply recognize that popes cannot always align institutional necessity with private conviction? The story began with a pope's handwritten admission of moral compromise. It ended with erasure, not of the notation itself, which survives in the draft manuscript, but of its integration into official record. The archive holds the anguish with physical permanence. It withholds its public acknowledgement, a truth spoken in solitude, yet never permitted to shape institutional memory. Some stories stop, not because endings are hidden, but because beginnings are deemed too fragile for history's harsh light. A confession preserved yet never owned, a wound documented yet never healed. The 1943 rescue list compiled by Father Pietro Palazzini, vice-rector of Rome's Seminario Romano, documented 47 Jews hidden within Vatican properties during the Nazi occupation of Rome. Palazzini's handwritten ledger, dated October 16th to November 3rd, 1943, records names, ages, hiding locations, and daily provisions. A marginal note, dated November 4th, states, "All accounted for. No losses." But the ledger's final page, number 12, contains only a single sentence. "Tomorrow we attempt to move the Cohens to Castel Gandolfo. Risk is high but necessary." No subsequent entry exists. The Cohens, Abraham, Rivka, and their 7-year-old daughter Leah, vanished from all records after November 4th. Did the transfer succeed? Were they captured en route? Did they survive the war under new identities? Yad Vashem honored Palazzini as righteous among the nations in 1983 based on the ledger's first 11 pages. The 12th page remains an open question, a family suspended between rescue and ruin by history's indifference to closure. The archive holds the intention with heroic clarity. It does not hold the outcome, not because evidence was destroyed, but because outcomes themselves sometimes vanish into time's fog. Some stories stop not at their conclusion, but at their threshold, a door opened but never crossed, a promise made but never fulfilled. Father Janusz Blachnicki's Dachau diary entered Vatican archives in 1946 bearing 87 names of priests who died in the camp. Cardinal Domenico Tardini's marginal note reads, "Vital for memorialization. Forward to congregation for clergy immediately." The diary was never forwarded. It remained in Tardini's personal archive, uncatalogued, unread by historians until 2018. Why set aside? Tardini became Papal Secretary of State in 1958. Perhaps he simply forgot amid Cold War diplomatic crises. Or perhaps the raw horror of Black Nikki's descriptions. Priests crucified on Baroque doors, starvation rations, medical experiments, proved too painful to process while rebuilding post-war Europe. Or perhaps Vatican officials feared memorializing Polish priests specifically would inflame tensions with Soviet authorities controlling Poland. The story began with a prisoner's act of remembrance under threat of death. It continued with a cardinal's recognition of its sacred importance. It stopped with an unfulfilled intention, a promise of commemoration that never materialized. Not malice, not conspiracy, human fallibility in the face of overwhelming tragedy. The Vatican preserved the evidence of martyrdom. It failed to complete the act of commemoration. This gap between preservation and purpose is where history often stalls. Documents survive. Their meaning waits for someone to activate it. Sometimes that someone never comes. Some stories stop not because endings are denied, but because beginnings are never truly received. Testimonies entering institutional memory, yet failing to cross the threshold into collective remembrance. The 1582 Gregorian calendar reform succeeded scientifically, but created an archival paradox still unresolved today. Pope Gregory XIII Commission dropped 10 days from October 1582 to realign Easter with the spring equinox. Catholic states adopted the change immediately. Protestant and Orthodox nations refused for centuries. Britain waited until 1752, Russia until 1918. Vatican archives contain thousands of diplomatic letters from the 17th and 18th centuries attempting to coordinate feast days across calendar divides. A 1634 memorandum from the Secretary of State proposes a universal reconciliation formula. A 1721 draft encyclical urges Orthodox churches to adopt the reform. Both documents bear notations, filed pending favorable conditions. No favorable conditions ever arrived. Today, Eastern Orthodox churches still calculate Easter using the Julian calendar, creating years when Catholic and Orthodox Easters fall weeks apart. The story began with astronomers' precision correcting celestial drift. It ended with theological inertia, a reform scientifically flawless yet ecclesiastically incomplete. Not failure, not conspiracy. The quiet reality that truth requires not just correctness, but reception, and reception demands conditions no archive can guarantee. The archive holds the solution with mathematical certainty. It withholds its universal implementation, a victory of science suspended by the slow tides of human consensus. Some stories stop not because endings are missing, but because endings require patience beyond any single generation's lifespan. A truth discovered yet not yet shared. A harmony composed, but not yet sung by all voices. Sister Maria Caterina della Croce's 1934 Vision Diary entered Vatican archives with episcopal endorsements and medical clearance. Her case was elevated to Pius XI for personal review. The Pope died in 1939 before rendering judgment. Pius XII inherited the file. A notation dated February 12, 1940 states, "For review after conclusion of European hostilities." World War II ended in 1945. The file bears no subsequent action. John XCI became Pope in 1958. A new notation dated November 3, 1959, for review during preparatory phase of Ecumenical Council. Vatican II concluded in 1965. Still no action. Paul VI, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict XVI, all inherited the file. All deferred judgment. Sister Maria died in 1968. Her cause remains open, marked under review for 90 years. Why perpetual deferral? Not hostility, not disbelief, but institutional risk aversion. Approving private revelations sets precedents. Rejecting them wounds devout souls. Better limbo than error. The story began with a nun's intimate encounter with the sacred. It ended with bureaucratic purgatory, a spiritual gift neither embraced nor rejected, suspended in canonical twilight for nearly a century. Not suppression, not indifference, The painful reality that institutions designed for permanence often lack mechanisms for timely discernment. A truth witnessed yet not yet judged, a seed planted in soil that never warms enough to sprout. Cardinal Secretary of State Luigi Maglioni's August 3, 1944 diary entry ends with, "Met with Popery, Allied advance on Rome. Matters of grave consequence discussed. Details to be recorded tomorrow." Maglioni died of a heart attack that night. The details were never recorded. Historians have spent decades reconstructing that meeting from peripheral documents, diplomatic cables, aide memoirs, Allied intelligence reports. But the Cardinal's first-hand account exists only as a promise of tomorrow that never came. The Vatican possesses the beginning of that critical conversation with surgical precision. The ending was stolen not by censorship, but by mortality. This is history's cruelest editing, not the erasure of truth, but its interruption by time itself. The archive holds what was written. It cannot hold what was meant to be written. Some stories stop not because endings are hidden, but because endings are prevented by biology's indifferent mathematics. A truth conceived yet never born. A bridge built in intention, but never crossed in fact. These fragments accumulate not as evidence of systemic deception, but as testimony to institutional humanity. The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-notation, mid-transfer, mid-review, leaving stories that began with moral clarity but never reached the resolution history promises. Not because endings were buried by shadowy forces, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. Popes living one more day to sign decrees, couriers surviving perilous journeys, political climates ripening for truth's reception. History promises narrative closure. Archives deliver something messier, stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because 10 days separated a decrees drafting from a pope's death, because a single night stole a cardinal's testimony, because centuries prove insufficient for calendar reconciliation. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed limitation. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's quiet entropy. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops, and in that stopping, we find something more human than conspiracy, the raw texture of sacred institutions trying, however imperfectly, to embody eternity within time's fragile vessels. The endings are not buried. They were never written, and in that unwritten space, history breathes, not as lie, but as living question awaiting answers time has not yet provided. In 1998, when Pope John Paul II opened the Inquisition archives to scholars, historian Carlo Ginzburg discovered a 1621 trial file against Venetian glassblower Marco Antonio Bragadin. Bragadin was accused of heresy for claiming that God's love exceeds the boundaries of any single church. Trial transcripts record 3 interrogations where Bragadin defended his view with references to Augustine and Aquinas. The tribunal's final session was scheduled for April 12, 1621. It never occurred. A marginal notation states, "Tribunal adjourned sign died due to plague outbreak." Venice's 1621 plague killed 46,000 residents, including the presiding inquisitor. Bragadin's file contains no verdict, no sentence, no notation of dismissal. He vanishes from Venetian records after 1622. Did he resume his work unburdened? Was he informally ostracized? Did he die of plague himself? The archive holds his words with legal precision. It holds the accusation with ecclesiastical gravity. It does not hold resolution, not because officials chose silence, but because history's machinery ground forward without him. One man's fate suspended in procedural limbo, while empires rose and fell around his unresolved case. Not conspiracy, not malice, the quiet tragedy of individual lives swallowed by institutional scale. A story begun with parchment and ink ended with a plague stealing its conclusion. Some endings never arrive because the world moves too fast to wait for them. The 2005 cause for beatification of Archbishop Oscar Romero contains a single document that halted proceedings for 13 years. A 1979 memorandum from the Salvadoran Military Intelligence Service listing Romero as target for neutralization with notation Vatican awareness confirmed via diplomatic channels. The memorandum entered Congregation for Saints files in 2007. A notation dated March 14, 2007 states, requires verification of Vatican prior knowledge claim. No verification occurred. No investigation into whether Vatican diplomats in San Salvador warned Romero of the assassination plot. The cause stalled until Francis bypassed the question in 2015, declaring Romero's martyrdom in odium fidei, without resolving the prior knowledge issue. The memorandum remains in limbo, authenticated as genuine Salvadoran document, but its claim of Vatican awareness neither confirmed nor refuted. Romero's story began with prophetic witness to the poor. It ended with institutional ambiguity. A martyr celebrated, while a painful question about institutional failure remained suspended. Not cover-up, not exoneration, honest incompleteness. An institution honoring a saint while acknowledging it may have failed to protect him. Archives preserve the question with archival neutrality. They withhold its answer, not from evasion, but from respect for truth's complexity. Some stories stop not because endings are hidden, but because endings require humility to sit with unresolved tension. A wound honored yet not fully understood, a saint canonized while his institution's complicity remains an open question. Father Yves Conger's Black Diary, the secret journal he kept during Vatican II, remains sealed until 2045 per his instructions. Its final entry, dated December 7, 1965, the Council's last day, reads, "Today we sign documents that will change the Church, but I fear the bureaucrats will bury them in committees. The real work begins tomorrow." Congar died in 1995, never knowing whether his fears materialized. Historians debate whether post-conciliar reforms fulfilled or betrayed Vatican II spirit. The Black Diary holds Conger's unfiltered assessment, his hopes, his disappointments, his private judgments of popes and cardinals. But that assessment remains locked away, entrusted to a future church Congar believed would be ready to hear it. The story began with a theologian's raw honesty during history's making. It will end, if it ends, in 2045 with scholars reading words meant for a church mature enough to receive them. Until then, it exists as potential truth, a story whose power lies precisely in its unread state. Not hidden by conspiracy, entrusted to time. Congar understood some truths require temporal distance to be received. His diary waits not because it is dangerous, but because it is premature. History sometimes needs to live through consequences before it can bear witness to causes. The ending is deferred not to bury truth, but to honor its timing. The Western Schism's resolution left Sister Benedetta of Siena's 1421 petition unanswered. Having vowed obedience to a pope the Church now calls antipope, am I still bound by my vows? The Rota Romana logged receipt on March 17, 1421. No verdict exists. No precedent established. No notation that the case was dismissed. Did she remain in the convent, her vows hanging in theological limbo? Did she leave, carrying the stigma of broken promises? The archive holds her question with heartbreaking clarity. It does not hold the answer, not because officials refuse to answer, but because some wounds of history heal without closure, leaving individuals to navigate ambiguity long after institutions declare crises resolved. Her story began with a vow spoken in good faith. It ended with institutional silence, a gap between dogma and human need that no council could bridge. Not failure, not conspiracy. The quiet reality that institutional resolutions rarely reach the margins where real lives unfold. A nun's spiritual crisis suspended while cardinals celebrated unity restored. These fragments accumulate not as indictment, but as testament, The Vatican archives do not lie. They simply stop, mid-trial, mid-petition, mid-diary, leaving stories that began with ink and intention but never reached the period that grants closure. Not because endings were buried by malice, but because endings require conditions archives cannot guarantee. A plague not striking, a pope living one more day, a courier surviving a perilous journey, a political moment ripening for truth's reception. History promises narrative completion. Archives deliver something messier, stories suspended in perpetual present tense, waiting for endings that may never come because time itself intervenes, stealing conclusions with fever, war, death, distraction. This is not failure. It is honesty, the courage to preserve incompleteness rather than invent false resolution. The real revelation of these fragments is not hidden knowledge, but revealed fragility. Even institutions claiming divine guidance operate within time's constraints, their grandest intentions subject to mortality's mathematics and bureaucracy's quiet entropy. The archive does not contain a single master narrative. It contains 85 kilometers of human striving, some stories neatly concluded, most simply stopped. And in those stops, we find something more truthful than conspiracy, the raw texture of time itself, indifferent to our need for resolution. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops, mid-sentence, mid-prayer, mid-promise. And in that stopping, we confront a profound truth. Endings are not inherent to stories. They are gifts granted by circumstance, timing, luck. Most human dramas lack them. Most lives end not with period, but with ellipsis, the slow fade of attention, the quiet shift of priorities, the gentle erosion of memory. The Vatican archives, for all their grandeur, reflect this universal condition. They do not hide endings. They document their absence with heartbreaking fidelity. The real secret of these archives is not conspiracy buried, but humanity revealed. An institution bearing sacred claims, yet made of mortal hands, capable of grand gestures, but vulnerable to mundane failures. Popes die before signing decrees. Cardinals fall ill before delivering verdicts. Couriers vanish between offices. Plagues interrupt trials. Wars scatter documents. Bureaucrats defer decisions until urgency fades. This is not unique to the Vatican. It is the human condition, amplified by scale, preserved by parchment, but fundamentally universal. And perhaps this incompleteness is not flaw, but feature. Perhaps the most honest history is not the one with neat conclusions, but the one that preserves its fractures, the questions without answers, the promises without fulfillment, the lives without closure. To invent endings where none exist is to lie. To preserve the stop itself is to honor truth's complexity. The Vatican archives do this with unintentional grace. They hold the beginning with reverence, the middle with precision, and the stop with quiet dignity. They do not apologize for the missing page. They simply present it as evidence, not of conspiracy, but of contingency. History is not a lie. It is a conversation across centuries, often interrupted, rarely concluded. The Vatican's 85 kilometers of shelved memory contain no single revelation that shatters established chronology. They contain something more valuable, evidence of human beings navigating impossible choices, striving for goodness amid imperfect knowledge, building institutions that sometimes uplift and sometimes fail those they serve. To study these archives honestly requires surrendering sensationalism for nuance, conspiracy for complexity, certainty for careful judgment. The endings were not buried. They were never written. And in that unwritten space, in the gap between what was intended and what was completed, between what was promised and what was delivered, we find history's most honest texture. Not the polished marble of finished monuments, but the rough stone of foundations left exposed. Not the triumphant fanfare of conclusions, but the quiet hum of questions still waiting. Not the certainty of answers, but the courage to sit with unresolved tension. This is the true revelation waiting in those silent rows of parchment and paper. that history's most profound truths often reside not in what was completed, but in what was left unfinished. Not in the verdict delivered, but in the trial suspended. Not in the letter sent, but in the one sealed and waiting. Not in the story concluded, but in the one that simply stops, mid-sentence, mid-prayer, mid-hope, inviting us not to invent endings, but to sit with the beautiful, painful, human reality of incompleteness itself. And that truth needs no embellishment to astonish us. It simply asks to be read, not as conspiracy unveiled, but as humanity witnessed, not as lie exposed, but as fragility honored, not as secret buried, but as stop preserved. History does not always end. Sometimes it just stops. And in that stop, if we listen carefully, we hear not silence, but the echo of every unfinished story waiting for an ending time is not yet provided.